Of the July 17th and 18th Veterinary Medical Board meeting started. Welcome, and we would like to reconvene and establish a quorum, so I'll turn it over to Jessica to do that.
Ms. Bowler?
Here.
Dr. Bradbury?
Here.
Ms. Laredo? Here. Dr. Nunez?
Here.
Ms. Prado? Here. Dr. Waterhouse?
Here.
Ms. Yanes? Here. Dr. Nolan?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Great, thank you. Then we also would like to move on to introductions, so can we have the public introduce themselves if they so wish to do so?
Jim Ferguson, First Source Solutions, Medical Director.
Karen Denver, Deputy Attorney General. Kelly Flores, Veterinary Medical Board.
Amy Zarsky, Veterinary Medical Board.
Dylan Christensen, Veterinary Medical Board.
Ginger Gerard, Veterinary Medical Board.
Jill Dworsky, Veterinary Medical Board.
Terry Perry, Veterinary Medical Board.
Patrick Lake, Department of Consumer Affairs.
Great, thank you very much. Due to travel constraints, we are going to go ahead and move to agenda item number 20, which will be Dr. Ferguson and his presentation to us. Thank you.
Doesn't matter. I really appreciate you doing that. Sorry to take you off of the normal flow of things, and I hope it'll be worth it. And I hope you don't mind if I kind of walk around and try to look at everybody too. If I make you nervous, tell me to sit down. Make me more nervous, but I will make you less nervous. Is the mic doing okay for you?
Totally fine.
Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks for having me. I'm going to start, I think, by warning you. You all have copies of this presentation. They're mostly correct. I'm an inveterate updater, so there have been a few updates, but they make it flow better. There are no significant contextual changes. So some of the slides are going to be looking embarrassingly technical. Okay, but the talk isn't. What the slides are for is your future reference. So what I'm going to try to do today, and keeping a close eye on you, and if I see eye rolls, I'll tone it down some. If I hear snoring, I'll tone it up some. But what I'm going to try to do today is tell you what the slides mean and not delve into technicalities. We can always deal with that later on, be it by emails. You're welcome to send me emails anytime, phone calls, whatever clarification I can give, I'm always happy to give. But I'm going to try to just focus today on what the slides mean rather than just drowning in technicalities, if that's okay with you. All right, so this is a compilation of questions that I seem to spend most of my time answering. And here they are for you. We're going to spend more time on some than others, but I'm going to hope that we finish this with a sense of what we can do, what we are doing, sometimes what we can't do, and how to really get to the points where I think you need to get doing effective, cost-effective monitoring. So this is, in my opinion, the most important question we deal with, getting the test to tell you what you want to know. And it's kind of got to be the right test first. Okay, I'm going to hopefully impress you today how different some of this testing is. Okay, tests don't equal other tests sometimes. Laboratories don't equal other laboratories. We have all these kind of shades of gray, which is why we're here. It's why we do what we do, to try to help make things clearer when sometimes they're pretty muddy. So it's got to be the right test. It's got to be collected the right way. Okay. There's very different ways, for example, to collect hair from some of you that have the hair that you all have on your head versus people like me. So it's got to be collected the right way. It's got to be collected when it's supposed to be collected. And if it's a hair test, we don't want to send it to a lab that only does urine and blood. So it's got to be the right lab. The lab has to have all the certifications. We're going to talk about this. This is an overview. It's got to be labeled properly, and most importantly, now this sounds really, really obvious, okay? If you're looking for ketamine, The panel has to contain ketamine. Not all panels contain ketamine. So we have to be sure we've got the right panel. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten somebody on the phone saying, he tested positive over here, he didn't test positive over here, and if you look, the panels are different. So it matters. Okay, are we looking for little tiny amounts of something, or are we looking for patterns of use over time? Different tests tell you different things. Are you trying to get somebody doing something on purpose? Do you care about accidental use? Do you want to know about all exposures? Or do you not want to know at all about accidental use? And believe it or not, we have some boards and some programs that don't. Now, it's not totally possible to rule out all accidental use, but we change things to do the best we can to rule that out. That depends on the program, depends on you all telling us what you want. Okay? We can't always tell the difference. Hair is the biggest bugaboo for accidental use. Okay, is it collected the right way? Yes, sir.
What do you mean by accidental use? Like accidental use? Meth? Or something like that?
Well, yeah, believe meth and cocaine. Basic drugs in hair can be transferred from your hands to your hair shaft. So looking for parent, I'm going to get to this later, but just
Okay.
quickly. No, by the time I get there, you might be asleep. So looking for parent drugs in hair doesn't help us because it can go like this. Okay. Looking for certain metabolites, especially metabolites from basic drugs like cocaine and meth. Okay. Happen in the hair shaft after they've been put on it externally. So yeah, I guess accidental use is not the right, accidental exposure maybe, but the drug gets there not through ingestion.
Okay.
Is a better way to put that. Okay. So we like to do, in a perfect world, every urine collection observed. Workplace testing doesn't do that. You're going to hear what I think about our testing versus workplace testing down the road some. But basically, to get into these programs, our folks have to study to get in there. So they're in there for a reason. They're really, really motivated and smart to pass the drug tests, and there's lots of different ways to do that. Properly observed urine collections help. Mixing up specimens like we're going to talk about down the road helps. Okay? But properly observing a urine test collection is not fun. It's embarrassing, it's time-consuming, it puts a lot of burden on collectors who are the lowest paid people in this entire tree of events. They have the highest turnover and sometimes arguably the poorest training. So they have to do it right or it doesn't get done right. So I want you all to know what I mean by when I say the myth of observed collections. In my skeptical point of view, sometimes a collection is not properly observed until I prove it as best I can by interviewing collectors, just because of all the things that can go wrong with that. And I'm not going to do any demonstrations. Okay. So questionable collections, if you're doing split specimen collections, you're splitting hair, blood, urine from the collection container into two specimens, as we need to do when we're doing forensic testing. It should look alike because they come from the same void. You'd be surprised how many times they don't. So, if they don't look alike, we have a questionable collection. There are physiological reasons for that sometimes. There's blood that can be settling and that over time during transportation can change the appearance of different bottles if there's more heme in one bottle than in another. But we have to figure that out. We can't automatically assume just because they get to the lab, they came properly collected from the same collection. So we sometimes have to look into that. You're going to actually see a slide that says this may be coming up soon, but I'm going to ask you before I get there because I don't want you to see the answer. What do you think the best way, y'all in the audience can't answer this question because you've heard me say it. What's the best way to pass a drug test? Yeah, I've heard me say it. Yeah, the best way to pass the drug test is not to take it. And keep in mind, we're dealing with detection periods here. And if you do something to interrupt the process, So a recollection needs to be done. You've effectively not taken a drug test. But I don't know. I got to stop doing the old cliches here that you all have heard too many times. Okay, it also has to be the right lab. Like I say, some labs do hair, some labs do blood, some labs do urine, some labs do it all, some labs don't. Some labs do clinical testing, some labs do research testing. One way to tell where a lab is best at, in addition to all the certifications that I put on this slide, is to look at their stream of revenue, where most of their bucks come from. If you have university research labs, they get their from NIAAA and NIDA and SAMHSA, and that's where their funding comes from. They're not necessarily going to be doing things like we want them to do in the forensic world. Doing forensic testing takes longer, it's harder, it's more expensive. So we can use labs, but we have to use them appropriately if they're not purely forensic labs. One of our best blood spot reconfirmation labs is a research lab. So we just have to pick and choose very, very carefully. So I'm listing on this slide a whole lot of different certifications. Not all labs have them all, but we select labs, and we work with about 8 different labs. We select labs that have these certifications, because even if some of them are not necessarily pertinent to the work that we're doing, the fact that the lab is spending bucks, human time, to get and keep those certifications says a lot about their quality control process, and that's what we're interested in looking at. And the reason that we're interested in doing that is because of the last bullet point here, which we're going to talk about laboratory-developed tests. We use a lot of laboratory-developed tests in the kind of testing that we do, because what we're doing is not SAMHSA workplace testing. We're testing for effectively hundreds of different things, not just the 5 to 12 that the workplace folks test for. Okay? So we have to use some testing that's pushing the edges of the envelope of the testing process. You've heard me talk about what to do with some of those results when they're right at the edge of the testing process. I know you've heard me talk about that, because some tests, all these test results are not necessarily cut in stone. Some you give a different weight to than others. So what we want to do is mix and match the testing that's available with your testing needs. LDTs are laboratory-developed tests. There's no federal oversight for laboratory-developed tests. They're developed by each individual laboratory. The laboratory has to support their processes and their data results. Okay. I help them do that. That's my job, because I picked them in the first place to send your specimens to. Okay. But a laboratory-developed test, it's important for everybody to know, has no nationwide federal oversight other than the nationwide organizations I put on the last slide that certify the entire lab and the processes. So when we do the blood testing for alcohol that we call PEth, there's no national certification for that. There's no national certification for hair testing. Yes, ma'am.
Could you clarify for me what an NLCP
I will.
stands for?
That is the National Laboratory Certification Program. It's run by the Research Triangle Institute out of Research Triangle, North Carolina, and in Durham, North Carolina, with SAMHSA dollars. And without spending too much time on the individual parts of the slide, I will tell you that is the toughest certification program in the country. Our specimens don't go to that because it's SAMHSA, because it's national laboratories. It only certifies the workplace testing that SAMHSA does and DOT. But NLCP inspects labs multiple times a year with hordes of inspectors. They go in with 4 or 5 inspectors each time. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and any lab that does that is likely to have really, really good processes in the rest of the lab that we use. And that's why we try to focus on SAMHSA and NLCP labs if we can. Now, some of you may know I'm a member of the SAMHSA Drug Testing Advisory Board, and we're looking at doing oral fluids and hair in the federal program. When that happens, the NLCP labs will definitely change. But it's taken a really long time to get it going, and I don't know when it's going to happen. So it's not going to be, the last meeting they had, they actually used the word if they come out in 2019, so we really don't know.
Could I ask you, is there the lack of federal oversight, is that because there's so many laboratories and they're constantly evolving these laboratory developed tests that they can't?
That makes it more complicated for sure, but the main reason isn't that. The main reason is that FDA and the federal agencies are not authorized to do that kind of oversight.
Okay.
They function on behest, what Congress tells them to do, what their charters tell them to do. And right now, they're not there. They talked about it. FDA talked about it. I don't want to get too far tangential here, but about 2 years ago in a DTAB meeting, they talked about it, that they were looking at it. But as you know, there's been a whole lot of administration changes and Bucks changes and everything else, so that's really not likely to happen anytime soon. Bottom line, does enough data exist to support the interpretation that we want from a test? My point is, if it doesn't, we shouldn't be doing the test. Okay, I said this about 1 million times, but I want you to understand that meaningfully, when I say we're not doing workplace testing, there's more room for error in what we do. We've got more humans involved, we've got more drugs, more metabolites, we've got cutoffs. We'll talk about cutoffs in a minute. Cutoffs that are lower. When cutoffs go lower, we're looking at tinier amounts of drug, okay? More specimen types, all sorts of things that go into interpretation of any test are pushing the edge of the envelope of this testing. Forensic testing, you have to actually remember back to first science courses you might have ever taken. If something works, if something is valid, a hypothesis is valid, it has to work more than once. Every test we do is done at least twice. Every test. If we don't get two results that say the same thing, you don't get the report. So when you get a positive, it's screened positive and it's confirmed positive. Some cases it gets reconfirmed positive. If it screens positive and doesn't confirm, the result is negative. Okay. If it doesn't screen positive, it never goes to confirmation. So the result is negative. Cutoffs are numbers and nothing more than numbers. They're not something that's written in stand. What we use, is the last bullet here, we use a cutoff that we choose, an administrative cutoff. It's a cost-benefit ratio calculation. There's nothing scientific about it. To lower the cost as much as we can without missing positives, we pick an administrative cutoff that is a compromise. It is not one of the top 2 bullet points, the limit of detection or the limit of quantification. That's the level that's as low as the lab can go.
You know that double testing you just mentioned, if it screens negative, or if it screens positive and then it confirms negative, it's negative?
Yes.
But if it screens negative, you don't do a confirmation because it was negative?
There's nothing to confirm if it's...
that the first will be negative and the second will be positive? If it's the same test on the same specimen?
It's a test on a different portion of the same specimen, but remember, a screen test is looking for a family of things. Is it possible to confirm something positive that's screen negative? Yeah, and there's a way to do that. But to do it on every single specimen is not affordable.
That's what I would guess.
Yes. Now, we're going to get to something down the road when we start talking about validity testing called the dilute protocol.
I mean, that gets to sensitivity and specificity. Like
Yes.
A false negative.
Yes.
When we're talking about cutoffs, we've run into some things where people have said they've been using cold medicine. I was just wondering, like, it seems like we would, cold medicine has such a low amount of alcohol in it that our cutoffs could be, at the level where that would screen that out. But what's your guys' take on this idea that cold medicine is causing a positive in both?
We're going to get to that down the road, but without completely trying to push it down the road, what I want to look at, and I want you to remember I don't even think I have a slide specifically on this. But a quant level, everybody wants to know how much there was. If it was a poppy seed, can't be very much, right? Or if it was alcohol from NyQuil, it can't be very much because it's NyQuil, right?
Maybe, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, but look at the detection. Cutoffs are relative to the detection period of specimens, which I have got slides for later. Okay? If you take something and then you go immediately to test, you've just ingested that. Okay?
Right, and it's at the peak of that
Now,
graph.
it's pretty low because it hasn't been fully metabolized yet. Okay? If the detection period is 3 days and you test a couple hours later, you're lucky if you see it at all.
Got it.
If you test it in the middle of that detection period, it could be pretty high. But if you test it at the very end of it, guess what? It's going to be really low again. So how do we know forensically exactly when that ingestion occurred versus when the specimen was collected?
So what you're saying is there's enough alcohol in NyQuil to be above the cutoff, and so that is a valid, okay.
There's plenty.
Okay.
There's plenty. Now, we generally say that it's the urine biomarker tests are more sensitive. Matter of fact, properly done, you can get urine positives from hand sanitizers. Okay? You can. People say that, but it's true. It works. Y'all know that, right? But we also say you're not supposed to get a PEF positive, which you shouldn't if you're taking as the label says to take it. But now look, NyQuil's got 10% alcohol in it. How much alcohol is in wine? 12%, right? So a bottle of NyQuil, 6 ounces, about equal to a 6-ounce glass of wine. So sure, you're going to get positive if you drink enough of it. It's going to happen. And kid yourself, some people do that. Funny thing about NyQuil is not just booze you're drinking. You're drinking all sorts of other sedating antihistamines that potentiate the effect of the booze. They're working together so you get a different high from it, different outcome from it. And people do that. So limited detection, limited quantitation are basically as low as the lab can go. Most of our labs will not report limited detection because it's a qualitative number. They won't report anything that isn't quantitative for some of the reasons that we're talking about now. But those folks are not administrative cutoffs. Those are expensive cutoffs. There's a lot of human work involved with that. Okay, this is a really important slide. And we just talked a little bit about some of the things in this slide. And now, based on those two questions, a negative test never guarantees the absence of drug, ever. Okay? That's why we like to mix up what we do. Because some tests are better at some things than other tests are. Okay? We can't tell by those levels, based on what we just said, whether the medication's being taken as prescribed or being abused. We can't tell impairment from levels, with one exception. Nobody's jumping on that one. The only drug test that represents impairment is a blood alcohol level. And the reason for that is not clinical. It's legislative. It's been legislated. People with tolerance can do a lot more with a 0.08 than people without tolerance. So there's nothing across the board that says everybody on the face of the earth is impaired at 0.08. So, bottom line, there's no dose-result relationship. We are on purpose pushing the edges of the testing envelope. Can we set cutoffs to minimize incidental exposures? Sure. Are you willing to do that based on the number of positives you also might be missing based on the metabolic cycle we just talked about and the differing quant levels at different times of the cycle? That's not my call. I can advise you, but it's your decision which one you want to do. Okay. Remember, everything is done twice, 2 bottles. And California, as you all know, is leading the way with the last bullet point here, but you're not so far in the forefront anymore. Cannabidiol versus THC. They both come from versions of hemp plants. Epidiolex is the only prescription version that's legal everywhere, and you only get it for very rare pediatric seizures. So, bottom line, we can't tell CBD from THCA. which is the metabolite we test for marijuana. Sure, we can test for CBD, but what would it prove? Okay? So the person's doing both CBD and smoking weed. We can't tell that apart. So we don't test for CBD because I think it's wasting your money. We can, but it's not something I'd advise. All right, we're going to leave that major topic shift here. Any questions before we do? Okay. Remember I said this isn't all cut in stone, so we get some specimens in there that can't be tested, and we have to put a name on them, and we call them invalid. And the definition of that is this: bottom line, these bullet points, but basically it's something that ain't right. And a lot of times we can't put our finger on it. But using the parameters we use, we know it's not right. Something's in it, it's the wrong color, something. Something is not right, and the lab rejects the specimen. The lab will reject it for two likely reasons. Not because they think somebody's been necessarily tampering with the test, but because they don't think they can get an accurate result based on what they're seeing. Or, even worse, they think that what they're seeing might be dangerous to the multi-million-dollar instrumentation that those folks have in their rooms. A couple of months ago, we put up a picture of a $500,000 LC liquid chromatograph. And Dr. Tony Costantino was here doing that too. He's got 24 of those in his lab, $500,000 a piece. So if they see something that they are not happy with, they're not going to risk the instrumentation to test it. So the numbers we use are these. And remember, we always use more than one thing. So if we're looking at specimen concentration, the main thing we look at is creatinine, but we also look at specific gravity. We look at acid base. We look at general screens for things that can be adulterants, but can also mess with the testing, such as oxidants. And because we're doing everything more, though, yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I
fine.
should probably let you finish your slide. When you're testing for the creatinine and the specific gravity, and there's some reporting, like in some of these reports, where the creatinine's less than 20, but the specific gravity isn't reported. What does that mean? Is that it's greater than 1020, or?
Oh, no. When the creatinine's less than 20, you will always see the specific gravity reported.
Okay, so in some of our reports where that's not the case,
Then we need to look at your reporting format and talk to your account manager and make sure that if there's some computer glitch that it's not coming out, you'll get it fixed.
Okay, thank you.
Because the only time you look at specific gravity is if the creatinine is less than 20. And then you always look at it. Because effectively, we just talked screening confirmation. Creatinine is the screen, specific gravity is the confirmation. If they're both below range, then it's dilute. If only creatinine is below range, it's not dilute. Now that's, frankly, folks, that's an old definition. Things don't change sometimes as rapidly as we think, and I'm going to show you a slide coming up that will show you exactly why that's the case. But formally, it's not dilute unless they're both out of range. But you'll always see it, and if you don't, question it. And there are certain labs, and they're not the labs that we use, for all the reasons I just talked about, okay, that will not report that. Some labs will even charge you more to report that. Okay, we're not doing that. Okay, so we get interference at any specific point of the testing process. And this is a listing of where those different interferences can happen. One of the reasons we like to get specimens to the lab as quickly as we can is because as a specimen ages, things change. If the lab says they're not going to test it for whatever reason, we're not going to try to bypass that and test it at a different lab. It's not worth doing. The longer we spend manipulating a problematic specimen like this, the more likely that the person has skipped to taking a drug test. So if we get this kind of thing, the recommendation, and then I usually see these and I put recommendations on them. It may be quick, get another collection as fast as you can. It may be do a hair, because it's old, and especially with the aging issue there, the specimen may be well past any detection period in urine, so you may want to check a hair or check a blood for a biomarker.
Could I ask?
Can I ask a question on urine? How many mLs do you require to split it into two samples from a collection?
45, 30, and 15.
Okay, thank you. And if you don't get that,
If you don't get that, the collector is supposed to toss the specimen out, do what they call a shy bladder procedure,
okay,
put
right,
the person in the waiting room and feed them fluid,
okay.
which I got a slide on that one too. It can be problematic if it's not done right. Now, that's overkill. All these things are overkill. Does the lab need that many mils to
Right,
test? And the answer is probably not. Okay, remember at the bottom edge of the dilute range, we call it substituted. This is basically water. Creatinine only goes so low in living beings. Okay. Okay, we've already talked about this. And remember, if a specimen's collection is properly observed, the likelihood of getting really weird creatinine-specific gravity discrepancies is not likely to happen. They're both measures of concentration. If one goes down, the other should go down too. It doesn't mean it's going to go out of range necessarily, but it should go down. Okay? If you get really weird results that have essentially no creatinine but a very concentrated specific gravity, that's not normal. Somebody's messing with the test. What we see more frequently about that is lower specific gravity and reasonable creatinine, which it means somebody probably came in with a concentrated specimen and they got access to water and dipped the cup. That's what that usually means. Somebody wasn't watching them at the collection site. All right, so we get asked what we do about this. So we talked about the dilute protocol. Okay, so when I tell you before that if it screens negative, it doesn't go to confirmation, that's right. But immunoassay screens, well, any type of screen, especially immunoassay, gives you a data printout. And here's the cutoff, but maybe here's the data. Okay? Lab tech is looking at that and reporting it as negative. If you're trying to pass a drug test and not to take one, just dilute out your specimen. The lower the concentration of specimen, the solution to pollution solution, right? The lower the concentration of specimen, the less drug is in it, the less likely it is to be above the cutoff. So what this is going back into the lab. And the labs we work with, not all of them have accepted this, but the ones that have accepted this extend the amount of time they hold dilute specimens so that we can decide if we want to do this. And then we go to the technicians and we go to the data. And if there are any data peaks at 50% of the screening cutoff or higher, then we do exactly what you ask. And we send it straight to confirmation. But we don't go to confirmation at the standard administrative cutoff. We go to confirmation at the limit of quantitation, as low as the lab can go. And because we're doing it carefully, we're doing quantitation, not testing without numbers. This is a forensic test and you can take it into a hearing. You can take an action on it. But that's the dilute protocol. Because the range of creatinine is very, very broad, it was designed for workplace testing. The positive results from the dilute protocol are not a huge number. They happen, but there will be many more negatives than positives by doing that. And this is why we care, though, to do it. Because even though we just spent some time saying you got to have two tests, a couple of us in this business wondered why. So Dr. Price has a series of articles out, and this is just one of them, where he took workplace specimens, not even our specimens. He took workplace specimens, ignored the specific gravity, corrected the creatinine to 100. Now the average creatinine is 130. Workplace testing is about 80 to 90. Our testing is about 70 to 80. So the more you test, the more you observe, the creatinine goes down. People have to hydrate to pee in front of somebody. Goes without saying. Still decreases the accuracy of the testing, and Price just proved it here. When he took those lower creatinine workplace specimens, look what happened to the results. The opiate positives increased 18%, the amphetamines increased 58%, and the weed went up over 105%. So concentration means something, and that's why we care. But we're not going to always get it, no matter what kind of manipulation we do with the dilute protocol or frequent retests or what. So since we know we're not always going to get it, we've got to mix up what we're doing. And if somebody sends in a whole lot of dilute specimens, I want to do a test on something else. I want to see what their hair looks like. Or if they're alcohol use disorder, I want to see what their blood biomarkers look like. Yes, ma'am.
What do you mean he corrected it? So I had two questions. One is what do you mean by he corrected the creatinine to 100? So like, did he actually add creatinine to the sample to, okay, so he just like had the people wait until they had a creatinine of 100?
No, we took specimens that were reported as negative.
Mm-hmm.
He had CRL, which is one of the labs that we use. Hold the specimens rather than discarding them in the week that they normally do. Hold them in the freezer, okay? And then they mechanically corrected that specimen until the creatinine got to 100. They concentrated the specimen.
Oh, I get it. Okay, they dehydrated it.
Yeah, the point of the study was to see what we missed,
Got it.
and that's what we missed. 105% of THC positives.
And then the second question is, do you know what the lowest humanly possible urine creatinine is?
Oh, sure. It depends on what condition the donor's in. You can have somebody peeing out a creatinine that's just barely over 1, but they're not likely to be applying for work as a truck driver, be in a hospital.
Yeah, no, I mean somebody who walks in conscious.
It's kind of like alcohol levels. There's a wide variation there. The other funny story about that that's right on SAMHSA is that they decided that while we're using a creatinine of 2 right now is the answer to your question, back in the 90s they used a creatinine of 5. Okay? And a flight attendants union said, heck no, we can do that. So they did. And they embarrassed the government. They actually embarrassed a couple of labs. And one of those labs is no longer in business. But they went in and just drank enough fluid to get their creatinine below 5, under observation in a controlled setting. So there's a lot of variation. I don't trust, even in our population, in the vast majority of normal people not trying to mess with the test or even trying to the degree that our folks do, 5 is a big yellow flag, for sure. Yes, sir.
That example you gave where you don't collect enough urine, in the waiting room and give them fluids, aren't you generally not their urine?
Yep, and I'll show you why. Yep.
And also a lot of probation complain about, the hardship of going to these drug testing centers. How long, is there a legal limit on how long you can make them wait at the center? Or
No.
they don't have a choice?
No, there's precedent, but not a legal limit. 3 hours is the precedent.
So you
And
can
that's
make someone wait 3 hours?
Yeah, that's the
to test them?
protocol. That's in the federal testing program. That's where that precedent comes from. Is it legal? No. But if the person doing the testing is under a SAMHSA umbrella or a DOT umbrella, then it's required. That's legal. If they're not, no, it's not.
Okay.
When you say the 3 hours, is that just with the shy bladder, or is that, okay?
That's a shy bladder.
But if, a person comes in, I need my drug test, they usually don't have to wait 3 hours.
No. Well, I hope not. I'd like to get a new collection site if they did.
If you had a creatinine of like 400, say, do we not check their specific gravity to make sure that that's actually very concentrated to match it, or?
You wouldn't need to. It's going to be very concentrated. It's not on this slide. That comes up. It's the next slide. We get that question all the time. With all you hear about synthetic urine and creatinines that are just on the other end of dilute, isn't that because somebody added too much creatinine? Most of the things that you can buy creatinine, you can do it for sure. What is mostly sold in the health marts is creatine, which does not go to creatinine. But that's what people take to do this. We have never seen any, and we're looking. NLCP is looking very carefully because the synthetic urine problem is huge out there. They've never seen any correlation between high creatinine and synthetic urine. And I You know, and I've been doing this since '91. I hate to tell you, I started when I was 10. In some ways, it's a better drug test. Because if the solution to pollution is dilution, the more concentrated the specimen, the more likely you are to find the drug.
Unless it's fake.
Yes.
But if the creatinine's like 450 and the specific gravity is 1080, that person wouldn't be walking in. So
Right.
wouldn't that be something you could check to see
Yes,
if
we
it's...
could, but the bang for the buck isn't there to do it.
I see. I mean, it's a refractometer.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And the reason is not clinical. That we have to establish this line between forensic testing and clinical testing. If we were doing that in a clinical setting in a heartbeat, we'd do that. Okay? We're not. We're doing it in a setting where we don't trust these folks. And whatever we get out of this process has to go to court. Everything we get has to be able to go to court. And early on in the program, back in the 90s, the collectors were allowed to do exactly that in the workplace setting. And you know what happened? Every time it went to court, the donor said, they adulterated my specimen. They put something in it. They took a drop out and put it on something. And they won. So now the precedent is, can't do anything. You pee in the cup, you split the cup, you seal it right there. Nothing goes in at the collection site.
Yeah, but, I guess this, we don't have to belabor it too much, but if it went to the lab and they did a specific gravity that was not consistent with a living human being that was conscious, that should be able to stand up in court, like with the creatinine problem. So that's why I was just wondering about it.
If you had the proper certifications in the lab, and in the collections, remember, the collection sites are not labs.
Right, no, I understand.
They're PSCs
I meant
and
at the
doctor's
lab
offices.
where there's looking at the specific gravity and a dilute specimen
But
as
it
well.
would, trust me, it would not be that easy.
Okay.
It just wouldn't. And the reason for that is a precedent from the 90s. Some of the very qualified people doing it.
Yeah.
Prove you didn't put something in there. Prove it. It's their word against theirs. So we just try to avoid the argument. And you've got points. We just try to avoid the argument.
That makes sense.
Okay, so we beat really high creatinine. And here's the shy bladder thing. 40 ounces of fluid for 3 hours, bottom line. But to your concern, you're absolutely right. Here's a graph of what happens when you do that. I'm going to have to try to get coordinated. I'm not going to shoot the laser over you all. I'm not going to do it, so I'm going to do it on this slide here. I don't want anybody standing up when the laser's going. All right, we're starting off with creatinine around 180. You can't see it, most of you. Then you're giving them fluid at minute 0, but look how fast those lines go down. So yeah, if you give them fluid and then wait 3 hours to collect a specimen, guess what's going to happen? So here's what I tell everybody I talk to. I tell them to talk to the collectors. I tell them, figure out when you're going to get called back. Now this graph says an hour. See, and I'm not buying that because they're starting at 180. I think most of our folks are starting way lower than that. So I say, when the collector can get you back within 30 minutes, no longer, you can drink all you want. But you have to get back within 30 minutes. If you don't, all bets are off. But the collectors are also supposed to document this when it happens. Most reasonably good collection sites have their own forms. The amount of fluid given, over what time, time start, time stop, time collected, all those things. It needs to be documented, and we need to get that documentation if we see a dilute specimen before we look askance at it. And even I still look askance at it because, I can go in there and say I can't pee. What are they going to do? They're going to put me in the waiting room and make me drink. And then I happen to know the MRO, and he's going to say, oh, well, I documented a shy bladder, so I have to give you a medical explanation for this, when in fact, it may not be the case. Get a little cynical over time, some of this stuff. All right, here we go again. This is just kind of a summary slide. Bottom line for this slide, what it means is recollecting urine is sometimes really not the best idea. Do something different. And make sure whatever you pick different qualifies in two conditions. You're looking at what we want to call the drug of choice or the drug of convenience, or the drug you're most concerned about, okay? And that the detection period is appropriate. The good news is about blood for biomarkers and hair for drugs, fingernails for drugs, is that they're very long detection periods. So usually the detection period duration's not a problem. But it doesn't make sense to do another urine in most cases. And here's the detection periods. Roughly. Hair and nails, if we don't trim the hair, can go back years. Blood for peth, we say 2 to 4 weeks. I don't buy it necessarily, and when I do reviews of those things, I really need to take a history into account. Somebody coming out of a 28-day treatment, yeah, they still do those, who had the party the night before they went into treatment, and if we had taken a peth right when they got to the clinic, it would have been astronomical. I think that, yeah, their peth will dwindle down longer than a 4-week period. So you have to be a little bit careful about interpreting detection periods. Here's a different representation of it. Just want to pick one that has an appropriate detection period for what you're looking for. It's back to the old thing we started with of doing the right test. Okay, and in the most difficult one to do that with is urine for the stuff we talked about based on the metabolic cycle, based on the concentration of the specimen, based on some people take a lot higher doses of drug than other people do. So no dose result relationship. So I just put this slide in here not to go over it today, but just for an approximation to show you what I'm talking about. Bottom line on this slide, what it really means without having to look at the numbers for any other reason than future use is there's a wide variation. So be careful when you make generalizations about detection periods. It can vary by drug, it can vary by biomarker. The main advantages of urine testing, it stands up way more easily in court than any other form of testing that we're doing. The science is locked in. The collection is much more problematic than the science for all the reasons we talked about. Hair and nail, collections are fairly easy, although they get messed up all the time. The science is not locked in. That's the problem. There's a wide variation on the type of testing that we're doing. I can stand up here and give you the normal thing about the hair looks back 90 days when it's properly sectioned at the lab. Well, that's hair from you all with the beautiful heads of hair that I'm looking at. It is not hair testing from me. I can get away with a lot more than that. The collection has less yuck factor. Well, obviously, all hair collections are observed. They have way less yuck factor. We can get them across international boundaries. We can do all sorts of things with hair that we can't do with urine. Okay? It's harder to test in the lab. That's why the science is not locked down. Urine's easy. Hair and nails is a lot harder to test because you have to liquefy it, you have to extract it, you have to wash it. You have to do as much as you can at the laboratory to prove that what you're seeing is actual ingestion as opposed to what we talked about, contamination. And science is still out on that. So, the forensic testing backbone is urine. That doesn't mean it's the only specimen you ought to be doing. That means that when you're looking at the results of your testing to take an action, though, you have a lot more confidence in a urine result than you do in a hair result. You have even more confidence, though, in urine plus hair. Problems come when you have negative urines and a positive hair. That's where you have to, think. Not saying you shouldn't do something, for all the reasons we're just going to go into here, but you've got to be a little more careful. So it's a lot harder discussion in court for hair and for blood path. It's a lot harder. There are some times when I've told the Deputy Attorney Generals it's not worth going to court because I think the argument is going to be so hard to have. They don't like to hear that. Sorry. The longer the detection period of the specimen, the more drug usage is required to produce a positive result. We already talked about the results being two-dimensional, why the quant levels don't matter. They really, really don't matter in these long detection period specimens. The same argument about urine, but magnified. Way worse. Okay. What is easily defensible are multiple results that say the same thing. To give you a perception of what's going on, the results have to say the same thing, most of the time. But what if you had a whole series of positive urines and a negative hair? Or vice versa. What if you had a whole series of positive urines and a negative hair? If we're looking at urine as sensitive, hair is not so sensitive. It takes more use to get in there. You get a perspective about what's going on, but I don't ever want you to think that disparate drug test results invalidate previous drug test results. They don't. Perspective, yes. Invalidation, no. Why? Because it's all forensic processes, all goes through two tests, screening, confirmation. They're good, confirmed positives. There's only one test that invalidates a previous positive, and that's a split specimen reconfirmation on the same specimen. If you can't get the same answer from two different labs of equal qualifications, then we can't trust the result. Here's the problem with hair testing. No, you don't have to memorize this. Just know that there's a lot of different growth rates, that there's growth stages, that here's the issue. If you look on this, scalp has 13% of its hair in resting phase and 85% in growing. But look at the trunk, look at the armpit. Armpit has 70% resting and only 30% growing. So if you test a 3 centimeter specimen of scalp hair versus armpit hair, you're getting a different test. Interesting, huh? So these are the unresolved issues in hair testing, which makes them a harder testimony. We have to be able to distinguish contact from ingestion, and we can't always. We have to be able to know that someone who does not have a large amount of melanin in their hair is getting the same test as someone who has a much lower amount of melanin in their hair. If you are following hair testing, this has been incorrectly called a racial bias, meaning that people with dark hair are much more subjective in getting positive tests. They're much more likely to get a positive test because melanin binds drug, period. It's not a racial bias, it's a melanin bias. If you have more melanin, whatever your ethnicity is, you don't have the same drug test as someone who doesn't have that kind of melanin, or someone who has white hair. All different sensitivities. That's some of the issues with hair testing. Sometimes that is, that's a no-no, and labs will reject dyed hair. They will not try to test them. Not all dyed hair. Depends on the process. Depends on what they see. So we tell people, even with dyed hair, to go get tested. Then it's up to the lab whether they feel that the specimen's testable. The issue becomes a compliance issue here because these folks are telling them, number one, don't cut your fingernails, or don't cut your hair, or once we tell you you can't go out and get a hair treatment. So theoretically, after they've been told that, that's a refusal to comply. Not a positive test, because they refuse to comply with the process. But yeah, the thing about, hair takes, you're looking at a 3-centimeter specimen, which is tested in the labs, but that's a 90-day cycle. So if you shave, you can't get tested for 90 days, assuming you don't do anything to the hair in the meantime. Easier to follow up with a fingernail because it takes fingernails roughly 2 weeks to grow, and then you can tell them just don't cut your fingernails a lot more easily than you can tell them don't treat your hair or don't cut your hair. So it is a good back and forth for that, but you still have to be careful with what you do with the results. And I keep having to encourage you that the lab testing is good, but you sometimes have to just act on the compliance issues.
Are they actually told not to cut their nails? Because in veterinary medicine, we're supposed to have short nails. Is that
Absolutely.
something?
And not only in veterinary medicine, a whole lot of specialties where you need to do that. And the answer is, yeah, but they're only told it for 2 weeks. So what happens most cases is you send them in for hair. They look at me. They don't want to do a hair from a private part of my body. So they say, okay, we'll switch to nails, but the nails are short. And they say, just don't cut them for 2 weeks and come back. You can do that. You can't do that with urine because of the detection period issues, but you can do it when you're having a detection period that's 3 months for hair and 4 to 5 months for nails. You could do that. That's also a much more easily judged compliance issue if they don't comply with that. And this is just more specifics about taking action on the alternative specimen results that we just went over. Urine testing is the backbone. Randomness is key. Okay? Mix these things up and use the total picture to decide on an action as opposed to one result, especially if that one result is hair or nails. Not so much with PEth. Not so much with PEth. This is an example just picked out of the blue. If you're going to be urine testing people this frequently, then you might want to consider hair testing this frequently. So you'll notice that on both of these charts, the testing frequency goes down except for the last year of testing. So I don't really care so much how many times you test them. I care that the testing be really random and really a surprise so that they wake up in the morning thinking they're going to be tested, whether they are or not. But I also think, and there's a lot of speculation about this, and I'm not going to dwell on it today. I don't know why. Positives always go up in the last year of monitoring.
Why?
I say I'm not. I don't know. There's a lot of debate about it. It's the loss of structure of the program. It's thinking they can get away. There's lots of possible reasons. We don't know why. But trust me, it always happens. Positive rates go up in the last year of the program.
So, Dr. Ferguson, since you aren't going to be present during our discussion over uniform standards, I know that you've been very involved in the uniform standards, specific to Uniform Standard 4, which is the frequency of testing. So do you have any insight or opinions on the frequency of testing as it relates to Uniform Standard 4 that they can use when they have the discussion later on today?
Well, the reason that I picked this particular protocol up there is because we've got some data on this protocol and it works. I do think you can test too frequently. I think, and I said before, that randomness in everything is the key to a successful program, much more than frequency of testing. I think, though, in the start of the program, you got to test them a lot. And the other Ferguson cliche, which you all know, is the best time to get a positive drug test. It's the day after a negative one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and that happens, and you've got to test a lot early on in the program.
What about, can I ask a question about the hair? What about if they have gel or hairspray or wax or any of those hair products in their hair? Does that alter anything?
No, those can be pretty well cleaned off in the lab pre-testing cleaning process. The thing that messes with the lab is the treatments. Okay, if the thing's on the outside of the hair, it comes off. When it goes actually into the hair shaft, it's a different story.
So that explained, I had a question why it went back up in the fifth year, but that's why you've
So do
got-
I really don't know the
But I
answer.
mean, but that's why your
Yeah.
graph shows more testing in the fifth year rather than the fourth year. It's just, that seems to be okay, interesting. Thank you.
I cannot tell you how many times I've done MRO interviews on people and they say they're 4, 5 months, weeks from the end of the program.
Interesting.
Can I ask a question related to that? Last 5 years, so that would be on people who had a 5-year probation. Is it different if they had a 3-year? Is it typical that it would go up in the 3rd year?
It will always go up in the last year,
Okay.
whether it's third, and the numbers are different for the shorter programs. I just use this as an example of how to mix, urine and
Okay, thank
and
you.
hair. I'm not holding this up as the be-all to end-all in program testing frequency, just as an example. Although, like I say, we pulled this from programs that had data to support it.
Can I ask one more question about that? In the last year, when you say you see more of the positives, is it both in urine and hair, or is it just in the urine, or is it just in the hair? I mean, is it specific to...
It's across the board.
It's across the board?
Yep. Yep.
Great question, but is there any rule of thumb that raises a red flag if 10% of the tests of a urine testing, let's say, are dilute? Is that a red flag?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if it's,
And
a few
especially-
here and there happens,
But, I think as a program, that when you see one dilute, you need to take an action. And I don't mean it has to be a draconian action. I mean, pull down the thing I wrote that's on our website. It says, this is how you avoid a dilute specimen, do it. And if they don't do it, then you take a different action. But every time something like that happens, you take an action. I would definitely, if there was a second dilute, especially to row, especially after you've given them that thing that I just kind of went over, I'd definitely do a hair test then. I definitely do some type of follow-up. I think it's hard to defend if you see an aberrancy of any kind where you don't take some type of follow-up action.
can I ask another question? Is that up to the lab to suggest that, or our probation
It's up to probation.
individuals? Okay.
Now,
got it.
obviously,
Thank
we're
you.
here for a reason. I'll be glad to give them my spiel if they ask. But, people on the phone, especially when I talk to them, from the ones that I talk to about the loose specimens, they say, you want me to go in and test these? It's not me. I don't send them back. So. All right, so here we get into different positives and negatives for different testing things. I'll skip that one. Urine alcohol is a lousy okay, we are skipping from testing frequency now to alcohol biomarkers, and then you'll be done with me. Okay? Okay. We have to do multiple different types of testing for alcohol because alcohol is alcohol. Urine alcohol is a lousy test. I tell you to take all the urine alcohol tests off your panel, except it's going to cost you more to do it than just to leave them on because they're dirt cheap. They really don't add anything to the panel, but actually when you have to go into a lab and get them to reprogram all their stuff, that costs money. Urine alcohol is a lousy test. There's lots of false positives. Diabetics, pregnant ladies, anybody with a urinary tract infection or any other kind of infectious process can have a false positive urine alcohol reading. Happens all the time. Never, ever, ever do a urine alcohol without looking both at the biomarkers, ETG and ETS, and probably glucose as well. So you have to mix those because if the glucose is present, glucose gets fermented to alcohol in the bottle. So we still have negatives followed by positives. And the reasons you all should be tired of hearing me say right now, because they're different detection periods, different cutoff levels, different sensitivities. The longer detection periods, PEth in blood is way less sensitive than ETG or the urine alcohol biomarkers. So just because every participant you have continually tests negative in urine doesn't mean you don't want to throw in a PEth every once in a while. I mean, alcohol is still the most commonly abused drug in the world. But you also may have people who continually test urine positive for ETG, for the urine biomarkers, and never have a positive PEth. That does not invalidate the urine positives. That just simply gives you a perspective about they didn't come from a whole lot of ingestion in the first place. So you may want to look at something dumb like food or NyQuil, or probably not hand sanitizers in our world. That's the only one that we can pretty easily rule out. So ETG is not stable, ETS is. Bottom line for this slide is you have to look at it all. You can't take one of these biomarkers in a vacuum.
So what you just said there about the NyQuil, if you're taking NyQuil at the prescribed doses for a cold, once a night, whatever, the PE,
Phosphatidylethanol.
thank you, that I actually remember that better, that would probably be negative.
Yeah. See this? Mm-hmm. This is a graphic representation of 3 different ways of drinking the same amount of booze. We used to say that only the top line there, that big peak at hour 2 would cause a positive PEth. We used to say that. I don't believe that anymore. I believe certainly that ingesting that alcohol, even in the second line, the 2 peaks, is likely, and I can't rule out some people, possibly with tolerance, possibly with an alcohol use disorder, if they can drink 1 drink at a time, continuously like that, still making a positive PEth. We are currently, so talk about things changing, okay, and even a couple years ago we put this thing up and said only the red big peak causes PEth. Well, we don't believe that right now. Okay, that's one of the reasons you cannot use this study to diagnose an alcohol use disorder. Because we don't know. You know, you can have social drinking with positive PEths. What you can use it for, and what the only thing that we use it for, is monitoring abstinence. And any of these types of ingestions is not consistent with abstinence. Now, yeah, we know that women form PEth more than men do. We know that people that have tolerance form PEth more than people who don't. Liver disease does not affect PEth. We've studied all that. We know that. But I can't tell you for sure if a low-level PEth didn't come from some kind of goofy stupidity. But what I can tell you is that after you do get a low-level PEth or a low-level biomarker or something like that, and you say, don't do it anymore, then they ought to not do it anymore. And then we can very easily do sequential PEths and make sure that's happening, if that was the cause of it.
But NyQuil would be negative on this.
Depends on how much you drink.
I meant if it was at a normal,
If you, according to the label instructions, okay?
Yep.
According to the label instructions, it should be negative. What you hear is, well, I'm not sure I took it that way. You know, bottom line is we can't prove that that level of ingestion didn't cause it. But if we tell them to stop and the PEth doesn't go away, then you can prove it. And sometimes it boils down to that. Okay, PEth is an LDT. Every time I have testified on PEth, I have been asked this question about junk science. Okay, it's, of all the things we talked about, including hair, it's the newest test. That's where the question comes from. But just because we're using it for these programs doesn't mean it's a new test. And there's lots of research on the date. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using it. For all that spiel I gave you about checking the labs and checking the tests, we wouldn't be using it. There's a lot of research. And I've given you some representations here. I just said there's no dose-result relationship. So when these studies find 2 to 3 drinks causing a positive PEth, keep in mind that's that study with that study group. So we want to look at another one that said 2 or 3 drinks can get to a PEth of 127 in that study with that study group. That's in the next slide. That's a Stewart group, and that was all women. So can you relate that to men? And that was all childbearing age women. Can you relate that to women of different ages? these are examples of how we've studied it, so we know that it is consistent with ingestion. We can't tell you about the levels with any certainty. And I put these there just as an example. They're not cut in stone. What I do like is Greg Skipper's piece there, where we're using PEth in combination with ETG. And those of you that listen to me know that I recommend that all the time. Okay, we can always get split specimens done. One of the best blood spot split specimen labs is that research lab I mentioned earlier. So yeah, they may not be doing it forensically, but you know, I could go back to 2 of those studies and show that this guy here, Marty Javers, is in almost all those studies. He's one of the lead researchers. If he tells me a blood spot's positive, I believe him. So you can do it either by whole blood or blood spot. I like whole blood because it's easier to handle. If you can't get a vein, though, a blood spot's better than not doing the test. Always offer reconfirmation across the board. It's a forensic process.
Is a blood spot just like a finger prick and then onto a piece of paper or something? Okay.
5 spots on the pad. Yeah, that's what it is. And the reason I like whole blood is because, I don't know if you all ever had your fingers pricked, but you know that if you're going to do 5 spots from one finger prick, then the quantity of blood at each one of those spots is not necessarily the same. And remember, we're talking about a value here of nanograms per milliliter, right? That's nanograms per milliliter of blood in the spot. So what we're really doing is testing a hematocrit. So if you get to the point and there's sweat or something mixing in with that and the hematocrit goes down, the PEth level's going down. That's why I like blood. Okay, last thing is, what do I do? And I hope you know the answers to this stuff right now. I don't do clinical stuff. I do forensic things. Okay? Regardless of whether I'm focused only on forensic things, the benefit of the doubt still goes to the runner. Okay? We do things really, really differently than clinical testing does. And I want explanations for all the positives. Now, it doesn't mean the explanation is going to be acceptable. But most of what I like to do is collaborate. Do I think I ought to be looking at every single test result you guys have? No. Some of them are simple. You don't. But I really want to be available when there's a question. Because you know what? I don't know all the answers. And the last bullet point there, I mean, sometimes people feel like their results get lost in my review because I'm talking to so many people if I'm not 100% sure of the answer before I give it to you. Okay, so we are doing a little bit of clinical stuff, mostly forensic stuff. We're checking about prescriptions. We can't really tell from the quant levels if they're being taken appropriately, but if you get sequential verifications of prescriptions, you can get a sense of how much they're taken. That's available on the prescription drug monitoring program in the States, but also it's available with pharmacy records. So there's lots of ways to look at this. I don't feel like I need to look at every result. I'll look at any result you want me to, but I don't feel like I need to. I feel like I can help you out when you need help the most, but not by looking at everything, unless you want me to. I'm not sure it's worth your time to do that, though. What happens when I talk to people, and there's the graph of what I do, what I ask. And yeah, it happens every time. And yeah, it's intended to go to court. We have forms that get filled out. And it's the same interview process every time. And they get told pretty much. Now, they're not going to get told what I'm going to recommend. And they ask me all the time. Especially for ETG positives. If they tell me they drank, I don't even like the NyQuil, that's too obvious, but if they ate chicken marsala or tiramisu, and they say, well, can't you prove that if you do a PEth? I don't answer that question. So that's up to the program. Don't talk to me about that. Do we do reconfirmations of urine biomarkers? Yeah. Do I think it's a waste of money? Yeah, I do. Will I hint around at that sometimes and refer them back to you? If I think the program might be doing a PET, yeah, I'll do that too. But I'm not telling them. If they really want to spend the money to get a urine ETG reconfirmed, we'll do it. But I think it's a waste of money. And I hope you understand the reasons why. So, bottom line, each result stands on its own, right? The only thing that invalidates a positive is a failure of the split specimen to reconfirm. And if you don't remember anything else I said, you remember that. Always put the dragon slide at the end. Okay, I appreciate.
The annoying question person. How much does it cost to have you come testify?
I don't know.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Well, I just know that sometimes, like, we need an expert witness to confirm.
Yeah. No, I know telephonic testimony is free,
Okay.
which is incentive to do telephonic testimony. But I don't know, and the reason I don't know is because I don't know how I don't do contract negotiations. And most of the pricing is similar, but it's not always exactly the same, so I don't want to put a number on record that I'm not sure about.
Okay, thanks.
I know travel expenses are involved.
Yeah, thank you.
How much does a urine drug test cost?
A hearing?
If, like, a person goes in for drug testing?
Oh, urine, I'm sorry. Again, I don't know. It can vary depending on the panel and whether the collection is observed. A lot of times, if the collection is not observed, the collection isn't even charged. Or at the most, it's $10 or $15. It's very low. But if it's observed, the price can go up $75 or $80. So an observed collection is much more expensive because nobody likes to do it. It takes time. And the urine test panels pricing varies widely depending on the size of the panel and the drugs that are involved.
So they're spending somewhere between $20 and $80 typically?
They're probably spending somewhere between $50 or $60 and a couple of hundred.
And the PET?
That varies somewhat by laboratory. I think the high, we've managed to talk these people down. I'm not telling you which lab, but we've managed to talk them. They started at 145, but the more competition, they're down closer to 100 right now. And it can vary between 90 and 120.
Thanks.
But then you sometimes get charged for the venipuncture too.
How often for the Vet Med Board, I know you do other boards, but Vet Med Board, how often do you think our staff that observes these results, gets the reports from the labs, contact you for confirmation, reconfirmation, or just general follow-up on
Again,
anomalous tests?
If they want a reconfirmation, they don't have to go directly to me.
Okay.
They can ask their account manager to get a reconfirmation done. So I can't give you a good answer on that.
Okay.
So on a drug testing report, there's a column that says OBS, that stands for observed.
Yes.
And then there's another column that says OBS, COM, and F, observed confirmed. Is that what the second column is?
It must be.
Probably.
So somebody observes a collection, and then somebody
I'd have to see the report.
confirms that confirmed?
You got to show me the report?
Yeah.
Put my glasses on for this.
These two columns.
If we have to confirm that it was observed. That's what we do.
That's going back and interviewing the
Yeah,
staff.
well, we was talking about we have to talk to
Collection.
collectors.
On this one, the hours difference, is that time between collection and the test being reported, or time between being called and the person collecting?
This is a different lab. We don't use this lab.
Okay,
So this is a little speculative.
okay.
When we put out our reports, we put the time of the call in the morning or the log on to find out if they need to test and the time they actually show up at the collection site. I would have to assume that's what he's doing here. but because he doesn't have the column for the time that they log on in the morning, I can't tell you for sure.
Okay. So
But-
that would be a long time between a call and someone showing up.
Actually, no, this is way too long for that. 190 hours? Oh, you know what he's doing? I don't even, I was automatically assuming this column had meaning, and it doesn't. This is a check.
I was too. I thought.
Nah, this is a check on him. This is a difference between the date selected and the date the result was reported.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one more question on your reports, on these reports? If we see a report like this, there is a differentiation of whether it's blood versus urine, but I think we see mostly urine.
Yeah.
Is that
Mm-hmm.
typical? Okay. But if there was a blood test in here, you'd see it, some sort of description in the
Yes, you would.
test type.
It would
Okay.
probably say PEth.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It would probably say what it is.
Okay. Thank you.
Special. Sydney knows that stuff better than me, because I
Yeah.
don't see that report. Anything else, folks? All right, I appreciate it. Thank you all very
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
getting me
you.
on early.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back. We're taking a 5-minute break now. Thank you. Break. And we're going to move to item number 19 on our agenda, enforcement and discipline process overview.
Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Rob Stephanopoulos, I'm the enforcement manager, and I'm just going to give, as you said, just an overview of the enforcement program. Okay, so the enforcement team, and this actually needs to be updated, it's me as the manager, there's 2 intake technicians, and we have 4 investigation analysts. We also have a probation monitor. I don't want to leave Sydney out. The complaints received annually, this is the prior year. Obviously, we do have more complaints that we've received this year in 18-19. We're about 1,200. So it continues to increase every year, which I think is something we'll talk about later on. Disciplinary actions and citations, I think they're probably a little bit less this year. And then the big number that's different is the pending complaints that we have right now. 1,300 is now, we're at 1,800. I think it's 1,830. So we've got quite a few. No, that's the pending complaints. So when you see, yeah, it's all of it. So when you see that report where I have kind of the buckets laid out where it says complaints over 3 years, 2 to 3 years, that's everything. So instead of being at 1,300, which is where we were last year, we're now at over 1,800. So yeah, we're in a little bit of a pickle right now. Yeah. So complaint sources, the majority of our complaints that we receive are from consumers, but we can also receive other complaints. So from the profession, we do receive complaints from veterinarians or RV2s, and I think a lot of the complaints that we receive are mainly in the interest of keeping the profession to a high level, which I think is wonderful. I think there are also complaints that we receive from other vets where it's a direct competitor and they want to kind of report them, which is fine too. If there's a violation, then there's a violation and we'll investigate it regardless. We do receive quite a few complaints from convictions. So when one of our licensees has had their fingerprints done, any kind of arrest or conviction that pops up, we'll investigate that as well. And then other governmental agencies, so it could be CDFA, DEA, Horse Racing Board, and then of course other DCA boards as well. So if we receive something from Chiropractic Board, then we'll investigate that and determine whether or not we have jurisdiction.
You don't have percentages of those, do you?
I don't. I would say the other governmental agencies, it's a smaller percentage of the complaints that we get overall. The vast majority is consumers, but I think we can look that up because that is how it's coded, so we can look specifically at the percentages of the different governmental agencies.
I do have a report, because that was one of the things I was looking at, what's causing the increase in complaints. And so that's one thing I asked our IT team to give us a report on the number of complaints received by source. And so that's data that we can provide at the next meeting too.
And also what what percentage of those complaints end up in disciplinary action? I mean, I assume convictions would be 100% disciplinary action,
No, not necessarily. No.
or
If
very
some-
high
Is that a prior
percentage.
conviction?
It really depends. I mean, if the conviction is not substantially related, or it's something that's not really going to have a bearing on the practice of veterinary medicine, then we might not take any kind of action.
Like, for example, how many consumer complaints result in disciplinary action?
I think if you look at the prior, I mean, it's basically less than 10% are going to result in some kind of disciplinary action. It's a really low amount. And this is a similar presentation to what we do with the association, because I think it's really important that we convey that the board is not out to get licensees. And I think when you hear enforcement and you think this is your regulatory board, licensees automatically kind of have their guard up. And we want to convey that it's really rare for a complaint to result in disciplinary action. It's not something we're looking to do. One of the other things is we're really looking to establish consumer protection at the lowest level possible. We're not looking to say, well, we can probably, go heavy-handed on this, but if there's no reason and we can get consumer protection or gain consumer protection at a lower level, we're going to do that. Unlicensed individuals, that's another source. I think we do receive quite a few complaints from, let's say, a receptionist at a clinic who notices that the veterinarian there is maybe diverting drugs, or if they witness some kind of animal cruelty, we'll get complaints that way. Intake will determine the jurisdiction once we receive it. I have noticed with our board in particular, I guess compared to the previous board, the vast majority of the complaints that we receive are jurisdictional. So it's a lot less compared to what I'm used to, and I think you asked that when I first came on with the board, is just kind of that proportion of complaints. We don't get too many where somebody's complaining and saying, I feel like I paid too much for this service, and sending a complaint to the board. The complaints that we're getting are really substantive. There's a lot to them. There is a higher level of complexity than I'm used to. So, not that I'm used to, but the proportion of it. So, the vast majority are jurisdictional. So as far as that should be a T at the end of there, complaint investigations, that's going to take place with our 4 analysts who are also termed desk investigators. And they'll perform the investigation. That's where they're gathering the documentation, the records, statements from the subject, the complainant, the consulting veterinarian, so somebody subsequent who treated the pet patient afterward. And they're also really going to obtain any kind of records that have to do with the care that might even seem like it's really kind of peripheral to it, but it's really important. I think when we speak to our complainants and they say, oh, do you want this, do you want that? I'm always of the opinion, just give us everything that you feel is related. That way we can kind of figure out what is necessary. It's better to have more than less, I think. Especially given when we spoke previously, I think about the, not rehabilitation, the restitution that we're trying to engage more in if it is appropriate. If we, at the beginning, can get receipts or invoices that have to do with the care, especially subsequent care, if the original subject veterinarian is found to be in violation and did something that was not within the standard of care, and that problem had to be fixed by a subsequent veterinarian, we're really going to want that because restitution might be appropriate if they had to pay thousands of dollars later on to fix presumably a mistake that was made by that original subject vet.
Did you say restitution is a recently new occurrence?
It's something that I think was done, but I think not in the magnitude that we're trying to do it now, where we're trying to make it a part of the process at the beginning, to where we are requesting that information from the get-go, and we're not trying to do it after the fact. So when it's already at the AG's office.
And who made that decision just to start to look more closely at restitution
That was both myself and Jessica.
without any input from the board?
Correct.
Okay.
Is that adding to the amount of time that it's taking to clear these cases? I always just thought that side of things was more of a civil matter, so I don't know if that's a common thing with the consumer protection
I don't think it's
agencies.
really going to hamstring things too much. If we're requesting all the documentation that has to do with that incident, I mean, I think that a lot of the consumers have everything pretty much in a file. I mean, when you talk to a lot of these people, they'll say, I've got everything you need, and they've got it all printed out. So if they do have the receipts or invoices, they can just forward those along, and that's something that we can, have in the file.
But you don't wait till you have the invoices to start the investigation on the complaint in general?
No. Either way, we want to start that investigation as soon as possible, but, we can only try to obtain restitution if we have that documentation. So it's harder when a decision is final, and then a consumer says, hey, I ended up paying this, and it's like, well, if you didn't give us that information, there's nothing we can go off of. We can't say, hey, you should also, pay restitution to the respondent. We need some evidence to back that up, and I'm sure that the DAG is going to need that information as well. So,
And as a consumer protection agency, we're trying to also help make the consumer whole, and if the consumer was harmed, maybe not physically, but financially harmed, I think it's on our part to try to rectify that. And that's also something that I know is important to the legislature. It's always a question in sunset about restitution and cost recovery.
Yeah, I'd just ask about the time, because if only 10% of the complaints result in a, conviction or disciplinary action, slowing the 90% down for that, and it doesn't sound like it does slow things down.
No, that's part of the process. And I think that with restitution, it's not it's not an everyday type of occurrence either. So I think that's part of our initial ask, is to obtain any kind of billing or receipts or anything related to payments, and that's not something that we get, I would say, even a majority of the time. But we want to make sure that we're actually putting it out there. That way, later on, it doesn't come back and seem like we're not trying to have restitution attached when it's appropriate, or somebody does reach out to their representative and says, hey, I ended up paying this, and the board didn't do their due diligence.
The restitution, if there's ultimate decision that it was required, be in the STIP, if there is a STIP involved?
Yeah, so it'd
Is
be in
that
the
how
final
like,
order.
In addition to payments for investigation fees and fines and
Correct.
whatnot?
It'd be in the
Yep.
final order, usually with a deadline to comply by. But those are all things that the board then would adopt and become final.
Where is I? So as far as the investigation goes, once we obtain all the related documentation to that specific complaint, in most cases, it's going to go to a subject matter expert. So that's one of our licensed veterinarians in good standing who is contracted with the board to review the associated medical records. And that's something that we can talk about later on as well, and what we're trying to do with that expert witness program. Once that review is done and the subject matter expert has formed an opinion and written up their opinion and provided it back to staff, that's when staff is going to make a recommendation on what to do with that case and how we should proceed. Obviously, based on the percentages that I mentioned earlier, the majority of the cases are just going to be closed either no violation or insufficient evidence. When the expert or the subject matter expert reviews that record, one of the other things to note is that they're not going to only be looking at the allegations that have been levied against that subject. They're going to be looking at anything else that pops out at the same time. And I think, obviously, most consumers are lay persons when it comes to veterinary medicine, so they're not going to know, hey, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, they didn't do this. They're just going to say, they did something wrong and my pet was injured or died as a result. So the subject matter expert is not only going to look at that, but they're going to look at other things as far as record-keeping issues, whatever it may be. And that, as kind of a whole review, we can determine whether or not we are going to take action or something lesser. So obviously the majority of our cases do just get closed with no violation. I think we do receive many of the reports where it does seem, and that's why you can't base it on the overall outcome, that our expert will review the care that was given and determine that it was within the standard of care. And obviously the outcome was not something that anyone would want to happen to their pet, but sometimes that it just happens. And those would obviously be closed, no violation. Insufficient evidence closures, they are common, and I would say that they're even more common when we receive a complaint that's anonymous, mainly because anonymous complaints, I think a lot of times are not as detailed as we need them to be. So if they're making an allegation of some kind of violation of our act, and we need to follow up and figure out, okay, well, what about this, what about this, what about this? We have no one that we can contact. So we are still going to investigate that complaint and determine if further action is warranted, whether we're going to send out the Division of Investigation or whatever it may be. But if we have very little to go on and we do an internet search, or we have staff will do like an undercover call just to see, hey, are they operating this way? Can we ask some questions? Because we obviously want to keep our costs down and not automatically go to D of I every time, because it is very expensive. But we have to determine if there is consumer harm happening and whether or not that is warranted, or if it's just going to be reasonable to close it insufficient evidence based on what we have. As far as recommendations to closure, so if there is maybe a very minor violation, we can close it with a letter of education and correction. Obviously, if there is a problem with an existing issue, we want to make sure that's corrected before we close the case. We don't want to close the case and say, well, we educated them on the law, but we know this is still kind of happening. That needs to be fixed. And then we educate them and say, okay, here's the law, so if this happens again, that's when additional things can happen, because we've educated you. There's no excuse if this happens again. Even though it might seem minor, we've put the effort out there, and so this should not be happening again. We can also...
Does that go on the website?
No, the education would not. And that actually comes up later on, but the citation and fine, that's an administrative action, so that would be on our website. And that's another option we have. It's a little, I guess it's kind of in order of, severity. So the cite and fine would be the next step after the letter of education. That citation is really going to incentivize compliance. We can also attach other things to the citation as far as CE, but I have noticed that our citation language is a little more limited than what I'm used to, because it does require that the violation had or occurred while engaged in the practice of veterinary medicine. So citations for, say, a conviction, it's not really, we can't issue a citation because that's not in that wording, because presumably it wouldn't have occurred during the practice of veterinary medicine. And then we can refer it to the Attorney General's office, which we'll touch on a little bit here, but then Ms. Denver will go into a little bit more detailed. And that would be to take discipline against the licensee.
And that's where, like, notices of public remand, we've seen
Yes.
some of those.
Correct.
on-
Mhm.
okay.
And that would be discipline, so that would be on that licensee's record for pretty much forever.
So, question, does every complaint that comes into the office go to a subject matter expert then?
No.
Okay, so there's quite a few that you handle in-house.
Correct, yeah. If we determine that there is the need, well, actually, it depends on what, well, no. Not all of the complaints that we receive will go to a subject matter expert, but the complaints that do go to the Attorney General's office, then they would have a subject matter expert reviewing that, or at least looking at that.
Well, you said the first screen is jurisdictional.
Correct, with intake.
Yeah.
So they'll determine whether or not there is a possible violation of our act. I think anything that intake is really good about it. There are some pretty clear-cut ideas when it's jurisdictional, but they're good about also talking to the analysts or talking to our experts that we have in-house to say, hey, this is kind of a weird complaint.
So like, for example, you get a complaint saying, he charged me too much. That's not jurisdictional.
Depending on the circumstances, I mean, if they're just simply saying they charge too much, then no, but I guess technically if they're saying they charged too much, but they were advertising this and I paid this, then there's a possibility of perhaps, I think, like a 651, BPC 651 violation where it's basically a false or misleading advertising.
Okay.
And we could take action for that. That's more of a thin kind of violation if that's all we're looking at, because a lot of times we're going to contact that subject and they're probably just going to fix it or give us some kind of sufficient mitigation.
So what's an example of something that's not jurisdictional?
I think, it's like what you were talking about, but we always have to qualify that. There's not a one-size-fits-all. So if somebody says, I went in there and I paid $70 for an exam, and I'm just throwing out numbers here, and the person down the street charges $60. This is too much. The
Okay.
price of an exam should be X. That's not going to be jurisdictional. There's also we do get complaints regarding the bedside manner sometimes of vets when they, people obviously, I mean, I had a dog myself, it's like a member of your family. So if they feel that this pet was not handled properly, or they feel like maybe the consumer, the pet owner was maybe being talked down to, they could complain about that and say that, that was unprofessional. But being a jerk, I guess, as a veterinarian, you're free to do that. There's no problem doing that at all.
We're not recommending it.
No.
But
It definitely could affect your business. Yeah, within reason, obviously, when there's threats and that kind of thing. But I think if, it's going to affect your business, but we do receive complaints where they say this person was their bedside manner, they were rude, they were this. And if there's,
So
that's really not
what's
gonna
an
be-
example of a case that was determined to be jurisdictional but didn't require a subject matter expert review?
go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like convictions.
Yeah.
So if they have convictions, you don't need a subject matter expert to do that. Sometimes, even if, if it was just a violation that the medical records were not correct, and in regulations, it's very specific in there. It's black and white what has to be in the medical record. So if something completely obvious is not in the medical record and it says that it has to be in there, maybe that wouldn't go to a subject matter expert. But not every single case should have to go to a subject matter expert. It's really on the standard of care
And
that we would
these-
want them to.
These are at the level of the intake.
No, so once it's determined that it's jurisdictional, then it goes to our analysts.
And they're going to
Okay.
determine whether or not an expert review is required. So, she mentioned kind of black and white when it's convictions. It could be medical records, it could be posting the license or an expired license, things that are really clear cut, that really an expert's really not going to contribute anything to that except for the cost.
So which staff members do intake and determine if it's jurisdictional? What kind of training do they get? And are you two involved? At what point do you two get involved in? Do you oversee everything?
I see all the recommendations, so where you see staff recommendations as far as how we're going to proceed with the complaint, whether it's going to be closed, whether we're going to
Well,
recommend.
Before that, intake and then whether or not it needs a subject matter expert review.
Well, that would be, before the subject matter expert review, I would be involved in the process. I think we're a really collaborative team. So a lot of times, staff is going to come over, have a case, and say, here's what we have, what are we thinking, and we'll kind of kick it around and figure out what we have to do. But ultimately, if that case is going to be closed, referred for a citation, a letter, once we've determined where we're going to go with that case, then there is going to be a manager involved. And it's going to be myself, and in many cases, Jessica's going to be involved as well if we're going to be issuing a citation or sending it over to the AG's office. But intake does have access to other analysts, the consultants, myself. Like I said, the majority of the cases are jurisdictional, so it's really clear cut, but I know they have come up to me on multiple occasions and said, this one's a little iffy. It seems kind of like it's non-jurisdictional, but we'll talk it out or we'll talk to the expert and
Can
figure that out.
can a complaint get completely dismissed without the two of you being even aware of it?
I think it is possible if we get a complaint that says something like, no, actually, it's not. No, it's not, because I know the intake, when they are going to close a case as non-jurisdictional, it does come to me.
Because they still do
They do
the recommendation would be to close non-jurisdictional.
Right.
And so everyone, whether it's intake or our analyst, they're having to write up a recommendation for why they think that is, and that goes to Rob.
Yeah. So when we talk about the caseload of 1,800 cases, they all are essentially coming to my desk for my review.
Okay.
before
And how
they go in
how
different directions.
how is the staff trained in all of these steps? What's the training?
Well, DCA does offer the Enforcement Academy training, and then when it comes to just the hands-on training, it would be the other analysts who, like I said, they do work collaboratively as a team. We have a variety of experience among the enforcement team, of different, there's people who have been with VetMed for years, there's people.
How do you train them as the enforcement manager?
How am I training them?
How do you train them?
I've sat down just to go through the process, and I think that's just been when I first arrived with VetMed, just to figure out what is involved in intake. And then I think I've inserted some of the things that I've learned along the way, because I was an enforcement analyst for years. I know that we've met with Jessica as well, with the team. She has a vast amount of enforcement experience, but realistically, my cubicle is right along the way. So anytime there are questions, we can go through that. But we have done some kind of dry runs where we go through that process, and I'm I'm actually wanting to make sure that we do that on a continual basis so that not only intake understands what the analysts do, but vice versa, that the analysts know what's in the intake process as well.
I think one thing that I think we acknowledged quickly is that we definitely owe our team more training on every step of the process, how the pieces all fit together, and also the investigations versus discipline processes, because before, as you may remember, it was kind of siloed to where it was intake and then we had 2 analysts doing desk investigations and 2 analysts doing discipline. So we need to do a lot of cross-training to make sure that they know what is expected and what to look for, and we definitely owe our team more training on that. And with Karen's help, because I think Karen, and I don't think we've introduced, so Karen is our new, she's our new Deputy Attorney General Liaison. And one thing that we talked with her, sorry, one thing that during our first meeting we acknowledged we need to train our team better. And one thing that I think works well is during these enforcement meetings where they can bring some cases and we're all meeting as a team to discuss what to look for and things to consider. Having our Attorney General Liaison there to give more input of what we need to prove it in the end is very beneficial for the team. And so now that we have her and she's in Sacramento, so it's much more accessible. And so we're really looking forward to giving our team more training.
Yeah.
She's the new Diane Sokoloff,
She is, yeah,
but she lives closer.
much closer.
Yeah. She'll actually be showing up to, I think it's next week? Yes, so she'll be coming by to speak with our enforcement team next week. I've spoke with the enforcement team just about having cases that are kind of questionable or that they might want to run by, and get her brain on it. And so we'll be doing that next week. And this is something that we do on a regular basis, just meet as a team, go over cases that are pending. And like I said, it's the enforcement process, it's really dynamic. It's not as simple as saying, hey, here's the process that you go through. The Procedures Act obviously is very clear cut. But when it comes to that investigation and what you should be considering, there's a whole bunch of things where it seems like, okay, well, here's what I'm considering right now, but that's why having access to a team is really, really important, because you get all these other insights where they say, well, that makes sense where you're going, but had you considered this? So meeting as a team and getting that kind of insight is really, really important, and that's something that we try to do as well, and I think having Karen involved is really going to be invaluable. We did it at optometry with our former DAG liaison, and I think it was really great because a lot of times there's kind of a barrier between once it goes to the AG's office and what actually happens and what is the AG's office looking for. And I think putting those two pieces together, I think just clarifies everything for that investigation or that enforcement analyst, and makes things just a lot better for them to understand and what they should be looking for. So, yeah.
Oh, go, did you?
Well, I just wanted to ask, thank you, Rob, for your explanations. It's been great. In your opinion, what appears to be the bottleneck? Is it as far as the increased numbers of pending complaints?
The obvious bottleneck is definitely our staff. We don't have enough. I've spoken with my staff at multiple meetings, and I think I've relayed this message to you. I'm extremely happy with my staff. I think they're a great group, and I don't have anybody that I'm worried about consistently, which is really, really a benefit. I think we just need more of them to handle the caseload that we're getting. When I was at optometry, and I don't want to go back to optometry every time and speak about it, but that's my experience. And I also spoke with Candace about this as well, I think maybe a few weeks ago. But when it comes to the normal caseload that's really feasible, 80 to 100 is really, it's a healthy caseload. And we've got basically 4 analysts, and we have our probation monitor as well, and she handles the probation cases where we need to do petitions to revoke. So we shifted some more work on her. But you look at 1,200 cases a year with 4 analysts, if you're saying 100 cases is healthy, that's outside that realm. And that's assuming that they take about a year to complete, because obviously the pending and the amount received is kind of 2 different metrics. But if you look at how long it takes and what we have as our performance measures, investigation is targeted at 365 days. So we're outside of where we
So they have about
need to be.
300 cases then?
Currently, well, with 1,800 pending, we've got about 450 cases apiece. And unfortunately, and that was something in my enforcement report, it is rising. And we are taking measures to address that, and hopefully we can address that. I know that budgets spoke about it a little bit. There are some challenges with our numbers that I think we'll have to discuss. I think Jessica and I will discuss. But we're doing what we can with what we have currently. But yeah, we definitely need more.
Good.
So one more follow-up question, and I know it's really easy to manipulate numbers, and we all know we can play numbers games all the time, but there has been, it seems like, an increase in intake, time to intake. And
Yeah.
I guess if you could clarify that.
Yeah, as far as the intake time, we were without, we have Dylan Christensen, he's our new intake analyst, who was hired in the fall of last year. But you can see that there's kind of a relation where that position was vacant. And we did have a rise. And I know I think January, when I spoke to you previously, we did actually cut down in that backlog quite a bit. But then we shifted over the convictions over to enforcement, which did cause a little bit of a spike. We're doing things slightly different with that process, but they should be with enforcement when there is a conviction.
Where were they before?
Licensing.
So, yeah, so it was being done in licensing, but it wasn't really being tracked until about probably like right when we got our new licensing manager, a year and a half ago, you started tracking denials. But that would not ever go into the enforcement side of it. So what happened is without tracking that, it takes time away from staff and resources, but we're not accurately capturing the workload. And we're also, when you did it in licensing and you weren't creating a case and doing an investigation, what happens is they might come in with a conviction, a DUI, and you don't necessarily know about it in the enforcement side unless they have another conviction of a DUI and they're not talking to each other. It may seem like that's their first one to the enforcement side if they're not looking back at when they came in, what did they come in with? And so that's why we felt it was better for everybody to track the workload first and foremost and make sure that it is the right people looking at the everything involved in the conviction.
I had a question in general, just because obviously looking at the increase in cases, et cetera, and the length of time in terms of resolution. I just want to clarify, we don't right now have any vacancies on staff in any level, subject matter experts, staff in the office, investigative staff, anything, is that correct?
In enforcement, no, we are fully staffed. Currently, we're fully staffed.
Okay. And then I had another question. You had changed, and I'm wondering, A, about training, and B, if you've been able to assess whether this is making it better or making it worse, maybe, I don't know. The way it used to, they were in silos, as Jessica said, and different staff took different parts of a complaint case, and then now one staff person, I think is how you've described it, will ride the case and sort of manage the case all the way through to resolution,
Right.
one way or the other. So that would require lots of extra training for the staff, because I assume a staff person at the beginning that used to do that doesn't understand what happens during the Attorney General situation,
Right.
things like that. So is that working okay, or is
I
that
think it is.
requiring staff dealing with some of the areas they never dealt with before? Is that bogging things down a little bit? I just wondered.
I don't think it's bogging things down. I guess it's kind of shifting
Should
things a
be
little bit, but we are saving some resources just because there is going to be kind of a disjunct between investigation and then going over to discipline. And when the AG's
Right.
office is asking questions about the original investigation, then that person in discipline who has the case has to talk to investigation, or if I know that, like I said, now Sydney is handling some of the petitions to revoke, which was handled by discipline before too. So there was, I think, too much, I don't want to say playing telephone, but there was some of that happening, which obviously there's an added cost when we have to have the DAG involved. And then there's the possibility of losing that in translation. So I think that, I don't think it's bogging things down, but it's hard to give you a clear-cut answer because obviously we're seeing that there's a rise in pending cases, but I don't want to confuse that with being the cause of it. Because I know that staff has been really welcoming of doing that because it does engage you better in what you're doing. They have me as a resource to just kind of go over that process. And the thing that, like I said, that's been great is that discipline has, I think, sat down in, I don't want to say discipline, but the former discipline unit, Wendy and Helen have sat down with our investigation team of Ginger and Kimberly to talk about that specific aspect and then vice versa. And then I think Wendy and Helen already had some experience with investigation, and then Ginger and Kimberly had some investigation or some experience with discipline. So it wasn't like they were going into it blind. It was just they're doing it full time now, so they just need to make sure that it's polished, and they have the resources in myself. Jessica's actually made herself available as well, and then each other. And that's really essentially why it's so key to have a really cohesive unit, which is what I have. So.
Okay, I just assumed that the training, you would need to give the staff the tools they needed
Right.
to carry a case through a period of time like they had
Yep.
never done it before.
And I think whenever we have staff in training, obviously they're not working cases. But I think what's really important is while it might slow down the process now, I think it's an investment that we need to make because we owe our team that training, and it helps our overall product, which is the case, be more complete. And if we have to take discipline, it's a lot smoother ironing out all the stuff in the investigation side rather than sending it to the Attorney General's office and finding that we have all these holes in the case. So I do think that a lot of the changes that we're making, it may seem like it's slowing things down, but it's necessary right now to make sure that we're fully trained. I also think that to your question related to whether or not it's working and gauging if it's working or if it's not working, if you look at just our numbers, it's going to look worse for a while. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are doing more training up front. We're doing, their staff, they're focusing on the oldest cases. And so what happens is when you focus on the oldest cases, a lot of times the oldest cases are the more complex cases. They're going to take a lot more time. So we're not getting cases that seem super easy and focusing on closing those. Since we're closing the oldest ones, we're going to be closing less of the cases. The cycle times are going to be longer because we have to get through these old cases. And so for a while, the statistics are going to get worse, probably for the next year or so. But then after that, that's when we can really reevaluate and find out, okay, did this help in the long run? I think with some of the changes that we're seeing, especially with the Attorney General's office, we've seen cases be turned around much quicker. And I think that's very indicative of just the process. And once we get all of our staff trained and we get additional help with the backlog, I think it's really going to help. But as far as, is it working now? I think that we're seeing little things, but we're not going to really be able to evaluate for another year or so.
So thank you, Rob, for what you're doing, and I think your team's doing a great job. Good job, team. I know you guys are buried, and it probably is disheartening at times, seriously, and you're doing really great work, and us questioning that isn't a reflection of us thinking that you're not doing a good job. So
No, I know you guys are concerned. I mean,
yeah, well, and I know it really is an overwhelming amount of cases, and I was kind of thinking, in the sprint, maybe we're losing the sprint, but having them all trained in the way that you're talking about will improve efficiency long-term, but it may, when there's a change, sometimes it slows things down a little bit. In regards to the long-term versus short-term cases, so I know that one of the things was that that when we've talked at various times that the older cases are so complex that they kind of were put aside, and so then now we're going back and looking at those. Is there a way to maybe have one person still set aside to look at some of the shorter-term things that are easier to close, so that there's someone, like, you can have 3 people kind of working on those long-term ones, but somebody who can kind of get some of the ones that are easier to resolve sort of moving through? I don't know if that's just an idea I had.
Well, I mean, and I think that the prospect could be problematic, because I think Jessica mentioned that our numbers can get skewed by combining old cases with new cases. And one of the challenges for a theoretical, for a BCP, I think, is actually having the empirical evidence to back up why you need that extra staff. And right now, and this is something, like I mentioned earlier, that I'm going to have to talk to Jessica about, is that our performance measures for investigation cycle times are 1 year. And to me, that's a bit high. And that's independent of any kind of discipline. That's just the time it takes that we're expected. That's our target time, which we're technically under. So having the mix of old cases with new cases is going to keep us probably under that, which if we do request a BCP and say, hey, we need people, and they say, you're meeting your target, you don't need people, but obviously we have this amount of pending cases that's going up, and obviously we need people because it's growing. We need to make sure that we can back that up with actual data. So I'm not saying that we need to hide the figures or do anything, not that that's what you're saying, but I think we should be working and investigating the cases based on what we have in statute and then on the order that we've received them. Because that's what we tell our complainants when they call in.
Yeah.
We get a lot of upset people who say, you got to expedite mine, and the other dozen people who've called that day want the same thing to happen.
I guess I'm a little, my concern is that on some of these newer cases, things like diverting drugs and,
Right.
and that sort of thing that are waiting, and those people are out practicing. I know that the negligence and malpractice and stuff is high on the list too, but if we really are, I don't know if there is a way to sort with.
There is. Intake will let us know, hey, we just got this seems like a real high priority, and we can jump on
Okay.
it as best we can.
And then is there, I don't know if it's possible because of the training that's needed, but in order to sort of get caught up, is there a way to have a temporary relief with, get a crew who comes in from another
Yeah,
and
that's-
helps with the
We
cases?
are, not to go into it too far in depth, but we are pursuing all options, and depending on what happens in the near future, we're going to have to be pretty agile with what we need to do, because obviously I want to get it taken care of now.
I'd like to add to your question of, is it possible to have a set team just work on the newer cases? Sure, but the priority though are the patient harm ones, and the reason why they're easier cases to close is because those are the lower priority ones, and so I would be very concerned if we wanted to devote resources, which we only have 4 of, to just closing the easier ones when it's not in our mandated priorities. And especially when we have 1,800 pending cases, and to our analysts, you might as well tell them we have 1 million, because it's not. But what happens is if we have those old cases from 2013 or 2014, and it's super complex, but animals are being harmed every day that passes, that veterinarian is still practicing.
Yeah.
And then we get, if we start devoting resources to these easier ones, it gets really harder to sell once we go to in front of an ALJ and we say, this veterinarian needs to be taken out of practice now. And he says, wait a second, this happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And
Nothing's happened since.
so I would be really concerned about that, doing it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. The last thing I guess I wanted to ask is, oh gosh, now it's gone out of my head.
I don't think it's appropriate for this board to tell you how to run your enforcement program. However, the numbers are looking worse, so we have to be concerned and we have to ask
absolutely.
questions.
Definitely.
The thing that's most important to me is that since you've changed the way it's done, that the training of your staff is there. It sounds like
Yeah.
it's going.
Yeah,
and
they
that
have
you're,
my support, they have Jessica's support, they
yeah,
have each other's
yeah,
support.
and that you're there and you're available. I hope you're buying them lots of pizza on Friday because sounds like they're working really hard. So pizza goes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Pizza
no.
goes a long way.
They have different
And-
diet restrictions, so I
Yeah.
can't get one easy thing.
We have a lot on
Different
Cato, so we just have to be
Keto and-
careful.
And then I guess I want to know when we can expect to see whether or not this program is working. I think you said about a year. So after about a year or two, you're going to, if it's not working, you're going to change it.
I'm not gonna say definitely a year, because it depends on a lot of other factors. It might take longer than a year, but know that when we are making these changes, we're monitoring them to see. So if and it might be just baby steps, right? So if we have a 2014 case or a 2013 case, and we are changing the process to where it's ready to go to the AG's office, but now we're putting a pause because we're looking at potential settlement terms. So it actually we're doing a little more up front, but then by the time we get it to the AG's office, it saves us a lot more time and money. So say we get a case turned around in 3 months at the AG's office, where it used to be a year at the AG's office. The overall time for that case in the numbers you may not see a decrease there because it was still a 3-year-old case. But what we would see the difference is a shorter time frame in the AG's office.
And it reduces.
Because it's better put together.
Right, exactly. And so what I'm saying is you might not, if you're looking at them now, you might not see the overall process being faster, but you'll see that piece of it is better. So once we are able, if we started a new case and we worked it in the beginning and then sent to the AG's office, once we get a fresh case, then that's when you really see all the pieces fit together. But we're monitoring each part of it, not just the overall time it takes.
Yeah, and I have to say that, I mean, it's not easy, I know. Veterinary medicine is a very super complex field. I mean, it's not one organ in one species.
Yes.
It's very complex, and it's not an easy job.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very surprising. I think a lot of the widespread issues has kind of, I mean, I'm in awe of a lot of the things that it touches.
I remembered my,
Sorry.
So I have a question on the other end of it. So as these cases are making their way through, then I assume that I'm sorry. So question on the other end of it. So as these cases are making their way through, then I assume that, not too far down the road, then they'll be asked, the board members will be asked to be reviewing more cases. So now we usually get like 6 cases a month.
Right, as far as
Sorry.
more cases going to the AG's office, which is going to result in
More
more action.
cases. Right.
Yeah.
And so do we have, I mean, how many cases might we get? Kind of just trying to.
Well, we have 1,800 pending,
Yeah.
and if we historically do maybe less than 10% of the cases, I mean, it's just a numbers game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Per year.
And I appreciate your text messages very much.
Yeah.
good.
I do too. I just want to, and I want to thank you guys and the staff. It is extraordinary what this board has to deal with. And, I mean, we've got hundreds of thousands of consumers and millions of animal patients out there, and millions of consumers too. But anyway, and I assume that because of everything we're doing and the fact that we're at capacity now, that the backup evidence for PCP requesting additional staff, given the statistics that are out there and what our processes are, will be compelling, I hope, given how you've realigned the system and just how
Yeah.
things are working,
And
hopefully to get some changes to our own staffing
Yeah.
budget. Is that something to be hopeful for? I'm looking at Jessica like,
I don't know who wants to take it.
yeah,
I think we'd be using that definitely as evidence that we are doing everything we can with the resources we have. Obviously, getting a budget change proposal approved, instantly, because everybody says the answer is staff. And I think I mentioned that in January, is that Jessica, and that's why I've enjoyed working for her, because she's very straightforward, but she's not one to automatically say we need staff as the answer. because that isn't always the answer. There can be things that you can change internally that have a drastic effect, or things that were duplicative or unnecessary. In this case, I think, to your question about all the things that we're doing and how we're reaching out to different, whether it's the AG's office or D of I or whatever it may be, we do have a lot of that evidence to say we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. So I think it is a lot more compelling that we're doing that, and we can say we've done everything we can with the staff that
All
we
the
have, and we
resources.
don't have, it's not something where I have to say, and, I have 2 of my staff that are, going through progressive discipline, so they're not really working. I've got a great staff too. Like I said, I just need more of them. We're trying to implement all these efficiencies, get rid of things that don't make sense.
Progressive discipline relates to performance issues, so just in case you guys didn't know, internal staff
Yeah.
issues.
Yes, which is
Which we don't
really refreshing.
So we actually have to be proving that we're behind before staff is approved? We have to be missing deadlines?
Yeah, so that's also an issue that we're facing to have to justify because our enforcement target for an investigation, a closed investigation that didn't go to discipline, is a year, which to me is a very long time to take for an
Right.
investigation that didn't result in discipline. But because of that target that was set a while ago, that's something they go to and they say, wait a second, you are meeting that, so what's the problem? So that's something that we're reevaluating to say, like, number one is a year reasonable consumer protection?
Who determines that?
So that all goes back to the performance measures that happened as part of the Consumer Performance Enforcement Initiative, CPEI, back in 2013. So a lot of those numbers were kind of just made up. They were, and anyone who was around at the time would say that. It's what is reasonable to say how long it takes. It wasn't based on any metrics. It wasn't based on this is what we're doing and this is a percentage that we think is reasonable. It was this is what we all think is a reasonable amount. The year time frame to close an investigation, though, from start to finish is unique. When you look at that performance metric, a lot of them are between 90 days to 180 days. That year time frame is rather long. My assumption is it's because of the complexity of these cases, but I still think that needs to be reevaluated.
Yeah. And I think that one would argue, especially given the complainants calling in and following up, if they looked at the investigation cycle time target as 1 year, I would venture to guess that they would say that that's unreasonable for consumer protection.
Can we as a board send a letter recommending that we would like it to be shortened, the timeframe shortened, or?
You can. It was an internal. It's an internal target that the staff at the time made. Not staff, but the people. It was an internal thing. So it's not something that the board needs to say, do that. But what I can tell you is that that's definitely a concern of ours that we're looking at now to lower it.
Okay.
Thank you. The other thing I was thinking about was kind of goes to the metrics that you're going to be measuring, I think, but where the holdups are, because while there's 1,800 cases, not all of them are sitting on your guys' desk, kind of like the legislation or the regulations, rather, is not all sitting on Tara's desk. 8 of them or 7 are on the budget desk. And so have you guys identified specific places, like how long does it take for a case to come back from an expert? How long does it take, at the AG's office? And is that something that, and I don't know if you know the answers right now, but that could help us to understand, where we might be able to streamline, or also, that where the staffing needs to improve.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that we've taken note of, and I know that the staff, as I mentioned it before, has gotten a lot better about reaching out to the AG's office concerning cases that are pending, and just to get the updates. The same thing with cases that are at D of I. They've been more proactive, and I think that has an effect. I know I do have quite a few cases on my desk, which I'm sure that they can nod to, but that are waiting for my review, and I want to get through them as quickly as possible with obviously the caveat that I am reviewing to ensure that we're all on the same page. And that is one of the key items is I don't want to simply, I guess, rubber stamp things. I want to make sure that as part of the training that you're kind of talking about, I want to make sure that when I find something that doesn't seem to fit or isn't consistent with consumer protection, that I go over and speak with that staff member and say, hey, I get where you're going with this. However, did you consider this? Or, here's what I'm thinking on regarding this. That way we're all on the same page, and there's not an inconsistency between the outcomes.
And I believe in the enforcement reports that you guys get. I know that the last page is typically just data points. And I think that that's always been presented. And in there, it will tell you average cycle times per thing, but I think there's ways to bring, better ways to present that to you, to bring that to your attention. I don't think it wasn't that it was never being brought up or brought to your, I don't think it was not being reported, because I think it was always being reported, but it needs to, I think, a better way to.
Yeah, I just didn't know what I was looking at.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was going to mention.
That was my concern.
And I know we're covering probably a lot of stuff on the enforcement report right now, but that was one of the things I was going to just ask is if there is specific data that you want that really hits home that you would like for me to represent better than the stats where it's all a whole bunch of numbers and you might look for something specific, then I want to hone in on that to make sure I'm giving you what you're looking for to something that's consumable and makes sense to you. I'm hoping that the showing where all of our cases kind of lie in those buckets helps a little bit, get an idea of what the violations we're looking at. But anything else where you say, hey, I'd like you to take a look at this specifically and, give us some data on that, then I'd be more than willing to do that and maybe cut out some of the other stats.
And I want to say when identifying certain bottlenecks, I mean, there were bottlenecks at every step of the process. It was taking us quite some time to send it over to investigations or to the AG's office. Subject matter experts, there's bottlenecks there. And they're all, each one seemed to have been significant. With division investigations, if they had pending cases that are 5 years old, that's unacceptable. Even the Attorney General's office, when I first started, I met with Linda Schneider, she acknowledged that out of all the programs that they do, we're number 2 for the longest cycle time that it took to do something. But I think that with more communication with the Attorney General's office, I think Linda's fantastic. I'm super excited with Karen joining the team, just more communication up front and then throughout the process for us to make sure to follow up. And honestly, the Attorney General's office is getting a lot more scrutiny too. They have to be more transparent on reporting their cycle time to the legislature too, which I think motivates them. And a lot of times now they're contacting us and saying, hey, I sent this to you last week, why don't I have it back? And that helps too. When I met with the heads of DFI and I brought our whole enforcement team to meet with them to kind of say, these are the problems that we're having. And a lot of times they would say, oh, we wanted to do an undercover, but we couldn't find a horse. But they waited 3 years to tell us that they couldn't find a horse. So that's unacceptable as well. And so it's really every step of the process has been bottlenecked. And so we're working with each part of it to fix it.
And I just wanted to say that, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but sometimes that is the case. And one of the things that I am happy about with staff is sometimes you get people who are a little bit shy and they don't want to, it feels like maybe you're having an unpleasant conversation if you're calling the AG's office and saying, hey, what's going on with this? Or DVI and say, hey, why have you not jumped on this? But I have to say that staff has been great about just picking up the phone and finding out what the status is and pushing.
Being squeaky wheel.
And that's really kind of what you have to do with some of these. She mentioned AG's office has gotten significantly better, which is wonderful, but I like that staff has kind of, dovetailed in with that.
Other questions?
On the year deadline, the kind of self-imposed year cap on the investigations, what do the other healing arts boards do? Do they create, is it similar? It's got to be less than a year for dental, medical, nursing?
It was 90 days.
And
I know
that's
that-
one,
But
one
when you-
organ, one species.
An organ system, yeah,
So-
one species, one
Right.
organ
So the
system.
complexity, I think, is a factor. But I
But
know that when I
still.
looked at just the list, I just sorted it by the target times, we were the highest. If you go on just DCA's website, you can sort it by that target cycle.
Yeah,
time.
and we can provide that information to give you
Well,
an
we-
idea of
Well, we
why that the year is unique.
And that's something that internally can be changed,
Yeah.
that goal or that. But even still, you said we're making that, it still doesn't seem like we are making the year, looking at the pending cases with the old cases, the, 1 to 2 year, whatever. Am I missing something?
So, and actually, we just added this onto the Sunset Report recently. So over the years, the team has met that target. But keep in mind, though, the type of cases that were being closed, right? And not necessarily the oldest cases were being focused on.
Right.
And also, even in the cases that we're closing now, I think the last fiscal year we were at 352, right? It was like right below. So they said, well, you're
Right.
meeting it. Yeah.
In 1 year, I'm going to expect 90 days.
I shouldn't have said that.
Any other
You've
questions?
done it before. You can
I
do
think
it
we're on
again.
the same page.
Yeah, she would, yeah.
Okay, we good with questions? Okay.
Oh,
Next slide.
so site,
Questions now.
Cite and fine. This is something that would be a little bit above an educational letter. Once again, it is minor instances of negligence. These are some of the examples: record-keeping violations, sanitation, expired permits or licenses, and obviously that's kind of the key here, is just that it's minor. Failure to display licenses, unlicensed activity, that can be egregious, but that's, obviously they're not a licensee, so we can't take discipline action against them. So if we have an unlicensed person engaging in the practice of veterinary medicine, then we can cite them, and in most cases, that's probably going to be, we're going to cite them as much as possible as far as the fine associated. Failure to update the address of record. So these are just some of the examples that we can issue a citation for.
Now, some of those examples I've seen in disciplinary orders.
Right. And that's why I wanted to key on that it's minor, but with enforcement, there's always going to be extenuating circumstances. And it's never a one-size-fits-all to say, okay, well, there's negligence and competence. That automatically is going to be, we're going after this person's license. It doesn't have to rise to that level, or
Okay.
anything they've provided or the nature of what actually occurred can mitigate that and make a citation be the most appropriate.
But the reason you would see that in disciplinary order is more often than not, you're going to see other things in there. It's not going to be that one little violation. So we try to capture everything in one, rather than do discipline for all these egregious, but then citations over here, because that's not the best option. I think it's putting it all in one document.
And next meeting, we're going to be talking about our strategic plan, and outreach is definitely a big part of it. I think that's a good topic for outreach to licensees, because, the conception is, oh, the board's going to get me for not initially, or not putting the date on it, or not putting,
Right.
that a lot of that, if that's really all that's done, is going to be
Yeah.
resulting in a citation.
Or maybe
educational
not,
letter.
because if it was something that minor,
A letter
it would
of-
be an educational letter. If it rises to a citation, it's more that it was willful, that we told them about it and then they did it again.
Yeah.
That's where you'd see a citation, not just a one-time deal, because we're not here to be punitive or penalize.
Yeah, and I know that when I was at optometry and speaking to some of the associations, even being with this board, I think it does make licensees feel a little bit more at ease, knowing, hey, just because you have this doesn't mean it's going to result in that. Here's all the options, and here's what happens the majority of the time. So it should at least give them a little bit more peace of mind. Classifications for citation, they're listed there. So there's 3 different classifications as far as the fines that we can issue. There's a maximum of $5,000 per citation. And then it's going to be that I should have put my glasses on. The Class A is that there is no patient death or harm. Class B would be that it had the potential to cause patient death or harm, and then C would be that it did endangered health or safety of another person, and multiple violations as well. So when there's aggravating circumstances to where we have multiple violations going on, then that would likely rise to a Class C violation, or, Class C violation, citation. And then also unlicensed practice is automatically a Class C violation, so it's going to be the highest level fine associated. Some of the considerations that we consider every time that we issue a citation, this is just something that we are required to do, and it just makes sense, and this is where it ties in with our recommendation that staff does, is they'll actually have these considerations listed. So they'll have the nature and severity, and they're going to consider all these, whether the violation was willful, history, cooperation with the board, any mitigation, and then other factors. So all of these are considered prior to issuing that citation and making that recommendation to say, here's all that we have, here's a complete picture, and based on all this evidence, this is why a citation is appropriate. And that's why when you were talking earlier about it's not automatically going to result in disciplinary action, this is kind of why, because we need to have those different considerations because it's not a one-size-fits-all.
So are there written disciplinary guidelines for cite and fines?
So cite and fines, they're not disciplined,
Yeah,
but the
Quote-unquote disciplinary guidelines.
what's in here, for everything that they consider, that's in a regulation that they have to put onto the recommendation letter. But it's a regulation that the board created saying in order to issue a citation, you have to look at all of these considerations.
So it is in regs.
It is absolutely in regulation.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously extremely wise to have that because it's showing that you're not being completely arbitrary with issuing a citation. You're considering everything. And you're being consistent with every citation that you issue. Formal discipline, and this is something that I think she's going to speak about in a little bit. Denial, revocation, or suspension. The code is listed there specifically as far as 483, which is really what we go home to. Criminal convictions, we need to determine whether it's substantially related. Once again, we're noting fraud, deception, negligence, or incompetence, which is what you said earlier, but obviously there's different degrees of that. Fraud, misrepresentation, deception, and obtaining a license, which seems like a pretty extreme act to start out the gate as an applicant and already engaging in that kind of violation. Using dangerous drugs or alcohol in a dangerous, injurious manner, major and or repeated violations, so maybe violations that if on their own would simply be a citation, but we see just this pattern that they've exhibited and they really are not abiding by our act, then yes, that could result in discipline. Cruelty to animals, obviously that's a pretty big one as well. And that puts us on high alert. So substantially related, and this is a quote from an ALJ, I think the question comes up with what is substantially related, because that is kind of a gray area when you're trying to think, and I know that prior to coming on with the board, I think I would be on the same page as many consumers and some of our applicants who figure, okay, well, what does this conviction have to do with, I didn't do it when I was practicing veterinary medicine, so what is it any of your business? And I think, in essence, this kind of conveys that veterinarians are held to a higher standard. They're expected to have a higher level of responsibility, a better level of judgment and discretion with what they do, because those acts done, quote-unquote, in their personal life can easily translate to a lapse in judgment in their professional life. And that's why, essentially, when it comes to substantially related acts, realistically, anything could be considered substantially related. Obviously, there's going to be some where we're going to consider it and it's not going to go there, but you could make that argument depending on, once again, that pattern that's established, the egregious nature of the specific act, to say, yes, this is definitely substantially related and we need to take action or deny a license based on that. Rehabilitation criteria, so this is something that we consider when we're going to take action for a conviction for discipline. We're going to look at the nature and severity, so it's similar to the criteria that we measure in the citation process. Subsequent acts, time elapsed, obviously that's a big one. If we have a DUI from 20 years ago, that's a pretty significant amount of mitigation. Compliance with the terms of the parole or probation, and then rehabilitation evidence. So a lot of times they'll say, I engaged in this kind of, in this class, or I attended this group meeting, And all of that is considered once again, and that would be something that staff would put in their recommendation, and all those would be measured and a determination would be made.
Doing this analysis up front is, again, it's set by regulation, and it says that in order to suspend, deny, or revoke, we have to consider these types of things before deciding to transmit it to the Attorney General's office. And so I think with our staff now, a lot of these things in the past, we would send it over to the Attorney General's office and ask the Attorney General's office to get mitigation. And a lot of this stuff is part of the mitigation, whether they're compliant with probation, whether they did a rehab program. We were asking the Attorney General's office to get that mitigation for us through the attorney, and then work from there. And so our team, before we transmit it, we're putting it on the recommendation up front. So yeah, that's going to take more time on our end. But the thought is, we save money, but we also know ahead of time if this person is rehabilitated, because we don't want to send it to the AG's office. The AG's office comes back with all this mitigation. We're like, oh, well, maybe we wouldn't send it to the Attorney General's office. You know what I'm saying?
Was that, and now I see how that could definitely increase the AG cost, but was that, do you think that thinking was that that maybe board staff felt it was out of our realm as a board to do this? It was more in the legal prosecutorial realm of the AG's office to determine find the mitigating information?
Perhaps. And I can't speak for them.
It doesn't have to.
I can't speak for them, but what I can say is when you're looking at the sheer volume of cases that we have, there's a lot of pressure to close them and to get them moving. And so if you have a team that's just getting pressure to get these moving to the next step, they're going to try to say, okay, here, we have this, okay, let's send it off to the next one, we got that, okay, send it off to the next one, to try to keep from drowning. And I think that may have played a factor, but again, I don't know for sure, but what I can tell you is this criteria is by law something we have to look at first, and that's what we're focusing on.
And a lot of these, I don't want to use the word change every time, but a lot of these differences that we're incorporating right now, I've talked to Karen about, Jessica and I have talked to Karen about, and I think a lot of the items she understands and says, yeah, that makes total sense. There are, I know we had a conversation the other day, there are some things where she's on the other side of things, which is great because it gives me a different perspective, and I think that's important, but that's why I think we're so grateful to have her right now, because she's been so accessible, not only with what we're doing in enforcement, specifically with the process, but also our expert witness program. So it's just good to have that feedback.
Can I ask one question of Karen just occurred to me? So when you get from a board the mitigating circumstances and the recommendations based on the investigation and everything else, does your office, are you required to reconfirm all that data and information?
No, and in fact, it does definitely speed things along if we get a case and we have all the information to plead it, and we also have mitigation and settlement terms. We can turn that case around so much more quickly. A lot of the time, if something's missing, then it delays, and of course, we're involved, so it gets billed some of that time. And then if we're waiting to get mitigation from the respondents, human nature, it takes them a while to get back to us, and it just kind of delays the whole process. Sometimes they wait till right before the hearing date. So it actually is great to actually know what the settlement terms are, and then we can offer those to the other side, and if they have additional mitigation, then we send that back over, and they can consider that and see if that affects their settlement terms. But it's hugely helpful. In fact, it would be nice if we got that on all of our cases, actually.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure there was no requirement legally that AG's office had to reconfirm all of that.
No.
So I think this is another critical point in the process. So after the intake and the investigations and you decide to send it to the Attorney General's office, that's when the either accusation or the list of statement of issues or accusation. And statement of issues is for applicants.
Correct.
And accusation is for.
Licensees.
You get an A+ today.
So then the respondent is given an opportunity to either request a hearing.
Yep.
Or go for a stipulated settlement with the board staff, right?
Well, so if we don't offer settlement terms, there's, they can do hearing if they don't want to settle. But if, say they said they just want to go to hearing, I believe it, and Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, to have mandated settlement conferences right before the hearing. And you have an ALJ who's involved in that.
But once they receive one of those two letters, they have an option to request a hearing or go to settlement with the board staff.
Sorry, can I just, so when they return the notice of defense, it basically, a lot of people want to settle their cases, and they get nervous about the notice of defense because it says, I want a hearing, and they say, I don't want a hearing. And so we explain, it's basically like entering a not guilty plea in a criminal case. It just preserves your rights. And so what we will do in a lot of cases, what I will do is I'll go ahead and set a hearing date. And just to get it on the calendar, especially a lot of veterinarians have counsel that specialize in these cases, so they're booked way, way, way back, so.
Hashtag Bonnie Lutz.
Exhibit A. So it's just good to get it on the calendar, and then we try to work out the settlement, and it also helps kind of give the respondent a little impetus to get us the mitigation. Sometimes it used to be that people would try to settle the case, and if it didn't work out, then they would set it for hearing. I set it for hearing and explain to them, if we reach a settlement, we'll take it off calendar, and even if we don't reach a settlement, all this information you're providing to us, you could present at the hearing anyway, so it's kind of a productive way to handle it. But no, you don't have to pick one or the other. That was your question.
I think was your question more that, is there any internal way for these things where it doesn't ever go to the AG's office? Was that your question?
I assume it's a lot less expensive and a lot less time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we could get a conviction or something happen in the case, but we are able to look at the rehabilitation criteria to say, okay, you have had a number of mitigating factors where it would not even rise at that point to the level to be transmitted.
I'll give you a specific example. You have a statement of issues for an RVT applicant who had a DUI 20 years ago, and it ends up in hearing. Why does it end up in hearing?
Can I answer that?
Well, I think he's asking specifics for a reason. And I can't give you a real justification for a 20-year-old DUI or an 18-year-old petty theft conviction. What I can tell you is from here on out, this rehabilitation criteria is absolutely followed, and the time elapsed is something to consider. On top of that, if you had a conviction from 20 years ago with our fantastic 2138, it's not even something that we would have jurisdiction over.
Yeah.
So
in that example, it would never, ever really
that's
have
not
a
even
statement of
something
issues.
that we could even consider with
And I
2138.
just talked to actually Wendy Garski about one of these cases because, as you probably know, in July of 2020, 480 is going to change so that you can't deny a license for a misdemeanor conviction within the last 7 years. So we were talking about what do we do now when these cases are going to come about. Right now it's okay. And so I guess for RVTs and RVTs with controlled substances that you have the authority to issue a probationary license. For a veterinarian, though, in order to get them on probation, you still have to at least file a pleading and go forward. Just in general, to issue a probationary. That's my understanding. So for some of those, because we're in this weird phase where things, are going to change, And, if the one we were talking about today, it was a bunch of older convictions. By the time it went to hearing, it might be right before the law changed, but then if she appealed it, the law would be in effect where none of that could be considered. So it's kind of like, if we have the ability to, and in this instance, this person had a bunch of substance abuse-related convictions from a long time ago. She seems to be fine now, but, clearly the board would want those conditions. So in that case, you could give her a conditional license. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
But I think with those two examples, they're very different to where your example was a DUI 20 years ago. And this example is the convictions, you might have multiple DUIs, and they happened maybe 5 years ago, and there hasn't been anything for 5 years, or even 7 years. When you have multiple DUIs, odds are you are dealing with someone who has an addiction problem that may be doing really well right now. But I'm still a little concerned that I think would justify some monitoring, because the world that they would be entering into, the world of veterinary medicine, is so unique to any other healing arts profession because of the ability to access the controlled substances. Unlike any other profession, most of the veterinary clinics, they have access to controlled substances. They can write their own prescriptions, and that's unique to healing arts. And everybody knows veterinary medicine is also stressful. And so I think that has to take into account if you have someone with multiple DUIs or multiple drug convictions. It might happen 7 years ago, but I still think that that's something where we have to monitor versus a 20-year-old DUI.
And, it's a really tough position to go to when you go to hearing or stipulated settlement, because sometimes due process is what it is, but sometimes it's almost like a crapshoot when you go to hearing, because we're going to have our expert witnesses, which may or may not provide the best, and then the respondent's going to have their lawyers, and then the judge may be completely ignorant of veterinary medicine. And the decisions that sometimes come out of some of these cases, I almost wish that we just settled them all in-house without going to hearing, because who knows what's going to come out of a hearing. Sometimes it's crazy. For various reasons.
Well, a lot of times the respondent's not willing to take the settlement offer, and then we go to hearing and we get that or worse. So I feel like the board tries to make reasonable settlement offers that protects the public at the same time. Sometimes people aren't quite ready to accept. That's probably what's going to happen. You're right, though. A hearing, it is a crapshoot. You don't know who you're going to get.
I mean, again, due process is what it is, but I would hope that we try to settle these things before going to hearings.
That's a priority, I think, on our side. On your side, if it can be settled and public protected, absolutely, it's quicker, less money, accomplishes the goal. That's always our first priority.
I'm happy to hear that.
So anything that affects a veterinary license where it's going to be probation has to go through the AG's office, so any kind of formal discipline. So we'll never have a settlement without your guys' help for that.
Correct. For
Okay.
veterinary license.
Thank you.
And then one of the other things, just to touch upon briefly, is a lot of times when we, I guess not a lot of times, but when we transmit that memo over to the AG's office and show the conditions we would be willing to accept, a lot of times we will have just surrender of license is what we're willing to do in this case. Just due to the egregious nature of the violations, we aren't willing to settle, and we wanted to go to a hearing. And I know that there are a lot of cases that I think I've run into to where, in speaking with the DAG, it seems like they are going to take it straight to hearing, and then the 11th hour, they decide, you know what, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to surrender my license. And obviously, we're not going to go there if we don't feel that our case is strong, depending on the circumstances. But if we feel that consumer protection is best instituted by not accepting any kind of probation terms, and we want to, we'll just take their license, then we're going to do that.
So for the interest of time, and I think a lot of it, we basically took your enforcement report away.
Yeah.
But Are there any slides that you would like to get to before, we haven't even gotten to Karen's
Okay.
presentation yet,
You
and
mentioned, let's see, due process, that was a big one, we kind of touched on that a little bit. Burden of proof, I actually think that's in yours a little bit. We talked about the outcomes. I think you were all familiar with what you ultimately decide. Public information, we touched on that briefly. The big part is complaints are not public, so we do get people calling in and trying to find out, and that's the big part of anonymous complaints too. When a complainant says, well, I would just want to be anonymous, I know this person, we have to tell them, we can't even acknowledge this complaint from this point forth. And a lot of times when we get that insufficient evidence and we want to talk to that person, they're not involved anymore. So those are not public information. Citations are public for 5 years, and that's once they've satisfied all the conditions of the citation. So if they're in a payment plan, the 5-year clock's not going to start until they've paid that fine off. Disciplinary action is basically indefinite. It's going to stay on that licensee pretty much forever. And then we're mandated to post it, and there's the code. This is actually a little snippet of our license lookup, which is really a wonderful resource that we have, and we are continuing to update it. We're going to have to retroactively ensure that all of our citations are contained on this as well, but it's a really great resource for consumer protection. I don't know. Yeah, that's okay. We can probably move on to the next one. Is hers? Okay, thanks.
Where is-
So,
Where is this in our packet? It is after 19? Okay. Okay. Oh,
Okay, so just to introduce myself, I'm Karen Denver. I'm very happy to be the new liaison for this board. We have a lot of different clients, but these cases are close to my heart because, well, I love my dog, but also animals can't speak, and these are among the most complicated cases that we deal with. So they're challenging, they're important. I'm very excited about working with Jessica and Tara and Rob and the entire staff, and it's a great group dealing with a lot of work coming their way. So I'm happy to meet all of you. And so these first couple slides are just to kind of give an overview of the Office of the Attorney General, of which you probably are all familiar. As you know, the Attorney General is a constitutionally elected officer who has a very broad range of duties. And within the civil division of our office is the licensing section, of which I'm a part. And our job is to basically represent boards such as yourselves in disciplinary actions, including up to, if they get appealed up to Superior Court, the Appellate Court, or even beyond that. And the main goal is to protect the public. So as we mentioned before, settlement is always our first goal, as long as it's done in a way that we believe can protect the public based on the circumstances. If I go fast, you can ask me questions, but I know we don't have a lot of time. Just to get a sense of who our clients are, about 60% of our clients are healthcare. About 40% are non-healthcare. So some of our other larger healthcare clients are the Board of Registered Nursing, the Dental Board, Board of Pharmacy, and the Vet Med Board, obviously. And so the process with our case is that the cases are initially sent over, and our supervising deputy attorney generals get the cases and they review them. They determine whether there is anything missing, whether it needs to be expedited, and based on that, they decide who to assign it to. It can be handles at different matter types, so we can file the accusation, which we discussed earlier, against a licensee, a statement of issues for an applicant that's been denied, a petition to revoke probation, which would originate, I believe, from Sydney, a request for an interim suspension order, which is, it's basically like getting a TRO from the administrative court. So if something's really egregious and we want to stop them right away, that's what we would like to do. In talking about the backlog and all this kind of thing, for any of those cases where it's urgent, the quicker you can get it to us, the better, because we have a very hard time arguing that, this is super urgent when it's been a while, just because of the process. We also handle requests for Penal Code Section 23 recommendations, which is when a licensee is charged with a crime that is substantially related. We can go to the court and ask as a condition of bail that they refrain from the practice that they're licensed for. We also can file an 820 petition, which is filed when there's any concern about a licensee's mental or physical ability to carry out the duties of their license, including substance abuse issues. And at the same time, the case also, when it's initially reviewed, the statute of limitations is noted, so that we can make everyone aware of that as we go along. It's also based on the geographical location.
Is there a statute of limitations?
Not for us.
Oh.
But if we were to say we had a case and we thought it was unlicensed practice, that criminal does have a statute of limitations, not related to us because it's criminal for misdemeanors. But the board does not have a statute of limitations.
And for petitions to revoke, as long as you get the case over to our office before the probation term ends, then it's fine. Then we don't have to worry about that either. So I'm with the Sacramento office. We also have offices in San Francisco, Oakland, San Diego, and Los Angeles. It's then assigned to the deputy, and a case file is open in ProLaw. And I don't know if you've heard much about ProLaw from Linda, but we do everything in ProLaw now. That's also where we get a lot of our information, where we can provide you with case status information, how quickly things are moving. As Jessica mentioned, we also have to report to the legislature now our case movement. So we have case movement goals, and we put everything in ProLaw. The idea being that anybody, if I'm out, anyone should be able to go into a case if something happens and see exactly where it is and what has happened.
So that's some kind of database?
Yes.
That's okay.
That's your version of Breeze.
Yes.
Our version of practice management software.
So when a DAG first receives the case, we do look at the agency cover letter to see what possible violations have been identified in the documents enclosed. We again check, well, this wouldn't apply with you for the statute of limitations, and to see if there are jurisdictional issues. We look at the certified license history and find out if there's prior discipline, and identify if there's any associated respondents, cases, or licenses. So in a case where you are seeking to file for formal disciplinary action, where there is, for example, a hospital and a vet or two vets related to that hospital that are all somewhat involved in one instance, it makes sense to include them all in one pleading because the witnesses are the same, it saves time and money. It's just a much more practical way of doing it. If at some point one of those parties enters into a settlement, we can draft a settlement specific to that respondent. And so we figure out whether or not it should all be included in one or not. We had some discussions about whether or not we could do them separately for purposes of tracking. The problem with that is that if we want them to be heard together, then we would have to file a motion to consolidate, to have them heard at the same time. And we really don't want to do it more than once, just for cost reasons, but also because, just to keep everything consistent at one time.
Now, we heard that our analysts have about 450 cases. How many cases does a typical DAG have that they're working on?
It varies. I think right now we have about 80, maybe about 50 that are active, meaning that they're not submitted for hearing or submitted for settlement or default or anything like that. We also have some writ matters, just depends. You get a writ, if your case goes to Superior Court, you go with it. So some people don't get very many, some people get a bunch, but that's about the amount.
And what efforts are made for the DAG to stick with the case until it's done, as opposed to transferring it to another DAG?
Oh, we always try to keep it with the DAG that it's assigned to. Occasionally, if something happens where someone is out of the office, unplanned for whatever reason, then we will reassign it, although sometimes what my SDAG will do, for example, she'll look to see how much time the person has already spent on it and to see if there's not a public risk in continuing the hearing, if maybe that's the way we should do it. We try to get all the hearings done as they come up, but in a case where it's really complicated and someone spent a lot of time on it, they will look at whether or not it just makes more sense to wait till they come back. And then every now and then, we will have some cases where if the client wants to expedite it, for example, we had some cases in Los Angeles that were kind of sitting for a while. They were shipped up to Sacramento so that we could get them pled, filed, served, and try to settle them. And then if they don't settle, we send them back to LA to be tried.
And then are there any DAGs that are specific for veterinary medicine that can do things quicker and, or?
No, it is spread out. We have different levels of deputies, and your cases typically go to the higher level deputies because they just are more complicated. A lot of expert witnesses. So we have quite a range, but there's not like one or two people in each office that handle vet board cases. So we look at the investigative report to make sure that everything listed there has been included. We make sure that they're on the witness list, see if there's anyone else that is not on there, whether there's any declarations. We also look just to see if we have, for example, with criminal convictions, we need to have certified court records. It just helps. We can still plead the case without them, but if it goes to hearing, we need to have the certified court records. So sometimes what we will do now is to go ahead and plead it, but then we have to request the certified records. And again, that's just one thing that is less expensive to be done probably by the staff than for us to do it. But that is something that we would need to go forward to hearing. Yes?
Can we send the case to you and work on that and get it to you later? For the
Absolutely.
okay.
Yes. So we would need the basic information, the uncertified copy, so we would have the details so that we could plead it. But yes, absolutely, we could get the certified one from you absolutely afterwards. The other documents that we look at that we would need to be certified are police reports, which are very helpful because we can admit those and not have to call the police officer, and there's certain parts of police reports that come in as direct evidence, and those are any admissions by the respondent and any observations by the officer. So in a lot of cases, we get in very good information without having to call an officer. The hearing's a lot shorter, but those need to be certified to get into evidence as well. Also, any kind of out-of-state discipline action needs to be certified so that we can admit that as a basis for discipline. And then any board records, which this board is very good about sending over everything with a certification so that it can just automatically go to the hearing and be admitted. The certified license history, prior citations. And again, those are all things we can get later and that you can do behind the scenes, but for purposes of hearing, we do need all those things, and it's nice to have them all at the front if possible. It's not always possible.
What about out-of-country disciplinary actions?
I have to look at the... does your statute allow for out-of-country? Yeah.
Yeah, we've had some things from Canada.
We've had some.
Sorry, Jessica.
No, you're fine. We do.
Yeah, we would want a certification for that, definitely, because especially if the judges aren't familiar with it and they may wonder, what is this? So, yes. Anything that we're using, any document we're using to try to establish the basis for discipline, we definitely want certified, especially those government documents.
For out-of-country discipline, we also want, and really out-of-state discipline too, to make sure that it would be a violation of our act as well.
Correct. And then we look for the medical records. It is very helpful. A lot of them do come over with a custodian of records, so then we could go to hearing without having to call that person, and we could just admit the records. We look at the photographs, in these cases, the x-rays, And I have not gone on social media, although I went on it to get information in a case recently and saw a whole bunch of complaints that could lead us to some other cases. But I personally have not entered any of that on your cases at least. But if, for example, if in your cases, if the expert report refers to an X-ray, we need to make sure we have that X-ray with our file when we get it. And again, this kind of goes to what Jessica and Rob were saying about putting in more time on the front end and getting everything together means so that once it gets to our office, it should go a lot quicker. And staff should absolutely feel free to call the assigned deputy to find out the status. That happens, all the time, and that's totally fine and actually helpful. With the witnesses, we need to make sure we have contact information so we can subpoena them and their interviews. With the respondent, again, it helps to have their interview because we can see defenses they may try to raise at hearing. And it's also helpful when they show up at hearing and completely change their story and we're able to impeach them with what they said to the investigator. So expert witnesses are critical in your cases. And the reason for that is that the expert witness has to provide information that is beyond general knowledge. And the vast majority of every part of your cases require that. Even some of the record-keeping violations where it says, for example, that you need to include a diagnosis or a physical exam, sometimes, for my purposes in the ALJ, we need an expert to say what's missing, why this isn't sufficient. So the expert witnesses in these cases are absolutely critical. And we have been working together to try to come up with a new format for those reports and also to kind of just streamline things and make it a little bit easier for the experts, which will in turn make it easier for us and help a great deal.
I have a procedural question on who chooses the expert witnesses or how they're assigned to cases, because sometimes I've seen in cases that we see there's a veterinarian who is an expert in one area but not necessarily in that area, so the respondent gets their own expert witness who has an abundant amount of expertise in that area, so their witness seems more credible than the board's witness.
Right, and that happens before it comes to us because that's part of the investigative package. I know kind of in our discussions that there's been talk about trying to narrow in on specialists for certain types of violations. Might be able to answer that better, but I know that's definitely a concern.
Yeah, I think when we're trying to hold a specialist to that level, that's when we would have a specialist be the expert involved, but I think we wouldn't have a specialist involved necessarily when it's a general type of practice situation that the subject was a general licensed vet and not a specialist. We wouldn't necessarily say we're going to have a specialist involved now.
So if they're assigned before they get to your office, where are they being assigned?
We assign.
They assign.
The board, our board.
Staff.
Will, I know, is there a new an expert witness training coming up in the fall? Another one? Will the new template for potential expert witness reports that'll be part of the new training?
I believe so.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's
Yeah, that new template's being made by the DAG or the Attorney General's office, or?
So it's actually like a group effort that the MDC Complaint Audit Subcommittee is helping us with as well. So they helped draft a new template report and guidelines. And so once we did that, we sent it over to Karen for input, and we want to make sure that we get our subject matter experts that are in-house. They're also looking at it, providing feedback. They're also testing out the format, so we can iron all that out before we roll it out.
That's great.
It is great.
So with the expert witnesses, what we do need is a current CV for them, as well as their contact information, so that we can contact them to subpoena them. But also, in some of these more complicated cases, once we plead it, before it's finalized, we'll send it to the expert to show them and say, do you agree with the way this is pled? Does this coincide with your opinion? Because we need them, it has to come out of their mouth what the standard of care is and how it's been deviated from. And so with the expert opinion, the training will probably go over this, is that they should be going into this completely objective, not looking for anything either way, and starting from scratch and just kind of going through the file methodically. And they can then determine whether or not there is no violation and it should be closed, if that's their recommendation, whether there is a deviation from the standard of care. And in the case of a specialized licensee, then again, we would be looking for someone of similar caliber to provide that opinion. We need to make sure that the experts reviewed all of the evidence and that in their report they list specifically what they've looked at, because when you come back 2 years later, year and a half later, it's hard to recall exactly what you looked at. And then we also have to make sure that the facts underlying the opinion are supported by evidence. Sometimes there's an allegation by an owner that this happened, and if that did happen, that would be a deviation from the standard of care, but we can't necessarily prove that underlying part. So, and we also look for inconsistencies in the opinion to make sure that there's no problem with that. That does raise one thing with this board in particular. We had some problems in the past where we had multiple expert opinions, and it just created opportunities for defense counsel to go crazy. And even if they were similar, just the way people word things is a little different, and even if they're addressing the same issue, and so it's really hard. We do have to turn over all expert opinions that are written for any case in discovery. So sometimes if there is an expert opinion that is really not good, that could actually cripple a case. Depending on the case, we can decide that maybe we should send it to someone else. We will have to turn over the other one, but maybe it's worth it. But the expert opinions, I can't stress how important they are for your cases, because all of your cases require them, and the ALJ really relies on them, as do we. Sometimes if there are inconsistencies in the expert opinion, the dad can call the expert just to kind of talk it over with them to see if maybe it's not actually an inconsistency. If you say, well, if with this factor, would that change your opinion? And we don't necessarily need them to write another report, because then we would have to disclose that as well. And again, we must provide all expert opinions in discovery. So occasionally, it's something that delays the case again, is that if we do have to return the file back to the client for further investigation or for expert review. Again, your cases always come over with expert review of some kind, whether it be in-house or not, so that's not a problem. But some of our other clients, we can't proceed without an expert, so send it back, and then it's a whole other delay to get that back. And then there are some cases where we decline to prosecute because we just don't have sufficient evidence. And in those cases, we don't take that lightly. We will write a detailed analysis of why the case is being rejected, and it has to be reviewed by our supervisors. It's not done lightly. And so then we get to the pleading preparation, which is the accusation or statement of issues. In it, we include the jurisdictional paragraph, the history of the license or the application, and the relevant statutes. And then we include the important part, which is the charging paragraphs. And those are the causes for discipline or the causes for denial of the application. What we use is notice pleading, meaning that the licensee or applicant has to know the basis of why they're being denied or disciplined. But what we don't want to do is to go into over overly go into detail, into the whole, it was a dark and stormy night, and, because everything we put in there, we have to prove. And a lot of it's unnecessary. Also, if you put in a lot of unnecessary detail, it can sometimes derail settlement because people will dispute one line out of it. Well, that's not true, and they don't want to admit to it or in any way because it's not accurate. So there's kind of a balance there. You want enough in there for notice pleading. And sometimes you probably have seen that there are variations between offices and how cases are pled. We can certainly work on that. I would imagine you probably want consistency. That'd probably be easier. So we can absolutely work on that. And again, the other thing too is that when we do these pleadings, we just include the necessary facts that for the charges. A lot of the other facts and information would come out at a hearing, but we don't need to put it in the pleading. And so also sometimes in the investigation report, the investigator will conclude that there's certain violations. However, the attorney has to look at it independently and decide whether or not they're supported by the evidence and whether or not they're appropriate. The deputy might also identify some additional violations that are not listed. So we're not wedded to the investigation report for the pleading. Yes.
I know that we're short on time, so I don't know if this is the right place, but I think I have heard that is a problem that we run into sometimes. Am I incorrect in that, Tara, where we've submitted something and then we get something back from the Attorney General's office that has these additional sort of things that we didn't bring up, and so then it kind of causes a problem? Is that?
I think we've had a couple funky things. One is maybe that the accusation or statement of issues included allegations of something not really supported by the statute itself. Like when you go to the terms of the statute, like the foreign discipline. One time there was a citation to one statute, but that statute only pertained to U.S. and U.S. territory, Canadian disciplinary actions, when in reality there was a whole separate Business and Professions Code statute that applied to foreign country discipline, and that was the appropriate citation to have made. So sometimes, the violations cited to particular statutes may be slightly off, but I think what we see more often than not is the administrative law judges going outside the scope of what's alleged in the accusation or statement of issues, and that's where we see the most trouble, because if the ALJ finds evidence of violations of statutes that were never pled in the accusation or statement of issues, that's a due process problem, because the respondent didn't have an opportunity to defend themselves against this random violation that the ALJ seems to have found.
And so, just so you know, so when we send over a pleading to you, if there are additional things in there that weren't identified initially, you can absolutely, when you send back revisions, you can ask to have that removed. The only part where we will have difficulty is if you want something included that we can't support by evidence. That's the only thing but it's your call. This sounds like the ALJ, and in fact, I know of one who tends to do that, comes up with entirely other violations in the decision that weren't pled, that weren't really argued, that weren't addressed. I think that's kind of hopefully a case-by-case process. And so we try to make all the revisions prior to filing the pleading, and then we serve it. We can amend it after filing. We can do a first amended accusation or a first amended statement of issues. We try not to do that just because it costs money to do, but if there is another cause for discipline that comes up, we absolutely should add it on there so it's all dealt with at one time. And when we serve the accusations, we only are required to serve the address of record, but personally, I try to find all of the possible addresses because I can't tell you how many times we end up with a default that then gets set aside because the person didn't receive it. So we try to serve all the addresses up front to just try to minimize problems down the road. And the respondent has 15 days to file their notice of defense after the pleading is served. Sometimes a person will get in a little bit late and we'll talk to our client and, we'll agree we should go ahead and accept it because otherwise if it goes to a default, they'll ask to have it set aside. We'll come right back to where we are. But that's the requirement is 15 days. If they fail to file a notice of defense, then we draft a default decision, which you probably see. And then if we do get a notice of defense, it will have whether or not they're represented. In my experience, I think all of the veterinarians I've dealt with have been represented. And so with that, because we are required to meet and confer with the other side before we submit our request for hearing, if someone is represented, I personally contact them immediately to find out what their available dates are, just so that we can get the ball rolling and get a date on calendar. It can always be moved or taken off, but it's just hard to get it on there. And we also have to make sure our witnesses are available. So sometimes some of these cases, it might take a little while to get it on calendar because we can't find a group of days where everybody necessary is available. If the hearing is 4 days or longer, I'm trying to think if it's 4 days or longer, then you are required to have a pre-hearing conference and a mandatory settlement conference prior. And this is actually talking about a trial setting conference, which I think they discourage now. It used to be if there was some dispute about setting a date, we would just have a trial setting conference with the ALJ on the phone so we could just talk and pick a date, but they're so busy they try to keep that off now. And when we set it, we estimate the length of hearing and the venue. So we try to, as far as the length of hearing goes, we try to estimate on the far end because it's really difficult if you run out of time because sometimes you can't come back for a month or two, and then everything that you've been thinking about, it's a big hassle. So sometimes we'll ask for a longer one because there's no harm in ending it sooner. And then the venue. I know in Sacramento, we try to set all of our cases in Sacramento unless there is a reason to set it elsewhere where there are, for example, civilian witnesses, a lot of owners and that who are far away. We might set it closer to them to make it more likely for them to show up and make it easier for them. But we typically try to set it in Sacramento to keep the cost down as well. In the notice of hearing, if there is a pre-hearing and settlement conference, that will be included in the notice of hearing. And discovery, our discovery is pretty straightforward. They request discovery. We have to turn over all the things that are set forth in section 11507.6. And vice versa. They're supposed to also provide us with all of that. Again, that includes any statements made relative to the case, so all of the expert opinions, any written statements. So we also then, we serve our subpoenas for the witnesses that are necessary. We do it by mail to make it less expensive, and we include an agreement to appear. So if we do it by mail and someone sends back the agreement to appear, then we're covered. If they get a flat tire or whatever, we can say to the judge, we need a continuance, they're under subpoena. Every now and then we'll do personal service if there's someone we really need who is either trying to avoid us or just not responding. And so when we get to the hearing, there's, if the respondent fails to appear, we would do a default. And there's two ways you can do that. You can either go ahead and do a prove-up hearing where you just go ahead and put on the case without the respondent, or you can do an office default where we just come back and draft a similar document. That's typically what we do, is we come back to do that. The administrative law judge oversees the hearing, and there's the testimony, and there's a court reporter there to take a record of the hearing. The accusations for your board's cases are clear and convincing standard because they are professional license. So with an accusation, we have the burden of proving to a standard of clear and convincing evidence. So that is the standard that's used in cases like child custody. It's basically between beyond a reasonable doubt and preponderance, which is like more likely than not, 51%. But it's a significant burden, so that is what we have to prove. With the statement of issues, the applicant has to prove by a preponderance of evidence that they are fit to hold the license. And with citations and the petitions to revoke and the interim suspension orders, we have the burden preponderance of evidence. After the hearing, the proposed decision is due within 30 days of submission of the case. It then comes to you, where you decide to adopt or non-adopt. And depending on what happens with that, we eventually end up with a final decision. The respondent can ask for reconsideration, which they may or may not receive. And then the next step would be to file a writ in Superior Court. So regarding settlement, personally, I try to settle cases on the shorter side. If it looks like they're probably going to settle, I try to get it done quickly because some cases just take a long time, so it kind of balances out. Sometimes, though, there will be additional mitigation the respondent provides that they don't get to you until later, and that the board has to consider to see if it affects their settlement. And also, anytime that a respondent comes back to us with a counter request for settlement, we have to convey that to our client, no matter what it is. So just so that you know, we have to convey that to you so you can make a decision. And typically, these offers are contingent upon evidence of rehabilitation or mitigation. So in the case where you were sending it over where you already have some of that and have settlement terms, that's excellent because then we don't have to wait for the person to gather all their information, and that would definitely speed it along. We spend a lot of time waiting and trying to follow up with people. Some of the areas in which we are able to negotiate with the respondents are in the area of cost recovery. Cost recovery applies to accusations only, and that is sometimes a place where you can incent a respondent to settle earlier because the costs will only go up quite a bit as we go to hearing because these cases involve a lot of prep time. And then sometimes just giving a discount on the cost recovery as a way to help incent them to accept a settlement term. Standard terms.
Karen, I'm sorry. So because we have a drop dead time at 1 o'clock, but I also don't want to rush and I want the board members to be able to ask questions freely when they have them. What I'd like to do is if we go ahead and take a break for lunch, because we have the 1 o'clock petition, and then they'll go into closed session, and then if we can pick back up, if that's okay with the rest of the board. After that, is that okay?
That'd be great.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take a break for lunch.
Okay.